The lead planner realized that the previous version of the game had been ruined by the greed of Rui Ji and designer Liu. Players and developers were fighting with each other. Only the insightful boss Pei Qian decided to cut revenue while preserving the game's reputation. This helped save the game. Zhuzhou thought fondly of his boss. Sure, gaming revenue had dropped, but Pei Qian had clearly foreseen this. The boss seemed almost like a god, illuminated by a bright light. Zhuzhou was once again convinced that he simply needed to follow Pei Qian's instructions. The new singer Ma Yan invited to the internet cafe proved to be a valuable asset. People stopped and listened to the songs from the street. Shannel sang so inspiredly and beautifully that all the tables were quickly filled with new customers. Their attention focused on the guitarist. From the outside, it seemed the young man wasn't even trying to play. He casually touched the strings, producing divine sounds. The singer's soulful music and warm smile left no one indifferent. His songs became a magnet for new clients. An hour later, the cafe was as packed as a concert hall. The enthusiastic cries of satisfied customers could be heard everywhere. A brunette at one of the tables told her friends that Shannel sings beautifully. The only downside is that it's too noisy. She admitted that she had been eyeing this cafe for a long time, and over time realized that it offered high-quality but expensive service. The woman raised her cocktail glass. She agreed that no one here really pushes their services. The brunette glanced sheepishly at the singer and sighed. The cafe had been given a treasure that one could only dream of. She said that the guy's face was familiar. Shannel, instead of going to university, had been studying music all his time. All the interviewees agreed that he has his own style of singing, in which one can hear notes of sadness. The unshaven man took a leisurely sip of his yellow alcoholic drink with ice and cried out in surprise. The brunette in the black dress asked, puzzled what was going on. The man, perplexed, declared that the drink was real. The girl laughed. Of course, that's how it should be. Every bar has a license to sell alcoholic beverages. The guy thoughtfully explained that there are many fakes, and they're not so easy to detect because the taste is similar to the real thing. His neighbor agreed and added that after drinking the counterfeit drink, one could easily end up in the hospital with poisoning. The brunette interrupted the guy and asked in surprise how they could even tell the difference between the fake and the original drink. They said that anyone who understands alcohol at least a little can feel the difference in taste. The young men and their companions agreed that this place was truly interesting. Their glasses clinked as they met. Sitting at the bar, Ma Yan told his friend that Shannel was a better singer than him. The friend angrily declared that he was now forced to work as a bartender. Ma Yan scratched his head thoughtfully and picked up a glass of alcohol. He asked about the new singer's salary. Zhang Yan said that in small cafes, pay depends on the singer's popularity and the owner's stinginess. Having handed the order on a tray to the approaching waiter, the bartender guessed that Shannel was worth a salary of no less than 5,000 yuan. Ma Yan watched the waiter with interest and said that the guy deserved his money, but the cafe was losing money and could only give out 1,500, with the rest in interest. Zhang Yan saw the waiter and customer smiling at each other. He asked what percentage they were talking about. Ma Yan proposed his own plan. To cover the singer's costs, half of the proceeds from drink sales would go to Shannel. The bartender was furious. No one had ever offered him anything like that before. He angrily exclaimed that half a drink would be too much. Ma Yan laughed. It wasn't that much considering their sales had been absolutely rubbish up until that day. Zhang Yuan stated that in this case, a new menu should be created, and the income the singer will receive should be honestly written under each drink. Using the Northern Lights drink as an example, the bartender explained that the total income was 20 wen, and Shannel would receive 10. This way, every visitor will know that out of the 60 wen paid for the drink, the singer receives a sixth. Ma Yan slammed his fist on the table. He was forced to admit that his companion's demand was justified. Pulling himself together, the manager smiled at the bartender and said he liked the idea. They'd get to it right away. After the performance, the hall became unusually quiet. Visitors quietly talked to each other and drank alcoholic drinks. Shannel chose a vacant table. He'd barely raised his water bottle to his lips when he heard his name called and looked up in surprise. It was Ma Yan. The man sat down next to the singer and immediately started talking about payment. Shannel looked at him in bewilderment. Having read the administrator's detailed plan, the singer scratched his head and said that it suited him. Ma Yan smiled and said that he was willing to make a small concession if the guy was not satisfied with the too small base salary. Shannel continued to hold the water bottle to his mouth. He replied that he would be very grateful if the amount were increased slightly. Ma Yan smiled. He agreed to pay 1,800 if the singer would persuade customers to buy drinks. Shannel hesitated. He admitted he couldn't force clients and would rather accept only 1,500 won. The manager turned away, waving his hand, and muttered disapprovingly that the guy could just sing. They'd give him a raise, no problem. Shannel couldn't understand what had come over him. Zhang Yuan himself took to the stage to make a short announcement. He thanked everyone present for their support. The man honestly explained that from today onwards, their singer would be paid a percentage of drink sales during his performance. Zhang Yuan urged everyone to support Shannel if they liked the guitarist's songs and order more drinks. The patrons began to chatter among themselves about the establishment's generous management. Many immediately ordered more drinks. Orders became more frequent. Waiters had to distribute alcoholic drinks faster and faster to keep up with everyone's needs. Free waiters rushed around the room with menus. They barely had time to take new orders for drinks. Ma Yan and Zhang Yuan joyfully clinked their glasses. They were both thinking the same thing. The singer gave them hope for a brighter future. When it was time to close the cafe, the staff lined up in 2 rows at the entrance, thanking customers. 2 young waiters told the attractive woman they would be glad to see her. The brunette gave them a smile. The 2 managers sat at a table in the empty cafe, counting their profits. Ma Yan sighed heavily, feeling a cloud gathering over him. They sold quite a bit of booze that day, but the notes on the sheet made the young man clutch his head. The proceeds were very small. Zhang Yuan laughed, continuing to calculate. He explained to his companion that more clients were needed to maintain normal turnover. The man looked at the waiters and figured he could make a tidy sum that evening. Once Lei got his cut, their earnings would be 20,000 a month. Ma Yan angrily shouted that this couldn't be happening. Not only would they earn a small amount, but they would also have to share it with the singer. Zhang Yuan sullenly asked him not to get angry and reminded him that Ma Yan himself had decided to give the guy 50% of their income. The man angrily crumpled the sheet of paper with the calculations and announced he'd changed his mind. They'd pay 5%, even though 1% was quite enough. Zhang Yuan laughed, folding his arms. He said that he couldn't go back on his promise. Otherwise, Shannel might leave altogether. Ma Yan couldn't stand it any longer and burst into tears of frustration. When he'd offered the percentage, he hadn't imagined it would be so unprofitable. Zhang Yuan suggested taking things slow. With a singer like that, the public would be on their side, and sales would quickly soar. Ma Yan couldn't believe he'd miscalculated so much and betrayed his boss's trust. He was so angry with himself that he started to cry even louder. The manager angrily slammed his palm on the table and shouted that he couldn't let this go and would tell the customers everything. His eyes blazed with hatred. Zhang Yuan looked at his companion in surprise. He'd never seen Ma Yan so angry. The bartender asked how he planned to do that. The young man pointed angrily at the stage and exclaimed that he would hang a large screen there. It would display the table number and the amount of drinks. Ma Yan shouted fiercely that one more line would let the customers know how much Shannel would earn for the evening. He raised his hands indignantly, shouting that he couldn't just pay such a huge sum. Everyone should know how generous Ma Yan was. Zhang Yuan liked the new idea. He smiled and gave it a thumbs up, promising to work on the information board tomorrow. The next day, Pei Qian called a car to the Tengda company office early in the morning. He had a lot to do. He felt fine until midday, but then, while working, he sneezed so loudly that he suspected he had a cold and threw a warm brown blanket over his shoulders. Suddenly, there was a knock on the office door. The man perked up and shouted to the visitor that he could come in. Opening the door, Chief Planner Lu Mingliang announced from the doorway that he would like to talk to the boss about something. The man noticed that Pei Qian wasn't feeling well. He was pleased to see that his boss hadn't gone home in such a difficult moment. Min Liang said he'd like to talk about the new version of the game first. Pei Qian tried to feign joy at the company's success. The lead planner said that overall everything was going well, but players learned about the purchase restrictions and were furious. Min Liang gave a high five and timidly suggested that they start by limiting weapons purchases to 5,000 units per month. Pei Qian barked sternly that he wasn't going to give in to anyone. In fact, the man quickly calculated the cost of the set, so he'd never go bankrupt. He declared that he wouldn't agree to sell more than 500 sets. Ming Liang nodded and smiled. He'd done all he could. The chief planner added that Ma Yi-kun would like to participate in the work on the new version of the game. He said the guy could be assigned to handle the paperwork. Pei Qian scratched his chin thoughtfully. Yi-kun had already been with the company for 2 months, so it would be suspicious to continually refuse him work. Pei Qian allowed the young man to be given some simple work and warned that it would still be considered as training. Min Liang happily thanked his boss. He had managed to resolve the most important issues to everyone's satisfaction. When the chief planner left the office, Pei Qian was still shivering from the cold. He had a feeling of impending danger. The man drummed his fingers monotonously on the table, ruefully thinking that the new version of the game would bring in profit. He needed to slow things down. Pei Qian closed his eyes and remembered that the studio had planned to continue filming the series. Fortunately, Huang Xibo was keeping quiet about it for now. Pei Qian suddenly realized what had been bothering him all this time. The revelation so startled him that his eyes widened. Pei Qian jumped out from the table, throwing the blanket onto the floor, and cried out in horror that the cafe was scheduled to open today. Shin's assistant reported that the car was ready. Half an hour later, the SUV pulled up in a neighborhood with new buildings. The young man carefully surveyed the room. Several dozen computers were already there, but there were no customers. Pei Qian sat down on the sofa with a cup of coffee and smiled. It seemed his worries were unfounded. This place would soon fall into disrepair. Seeing that Ma Yang wanted to say something to his boss, Zhang Yuan imperiously blocked his way, asking him to take his time. He looked at his companion in surprise. Zhang Yuan explained that it wouldn't be right to please his boss now. The young man asked what he should tell him then. The manager shrugged, spreading his arms wide. He reminded them that the cafe had only just started selling alcohol and needed to increase turnover a bit. Zhang Yan knew Pace and would inquire about their income. Ma Yan, revealing that they were still losing money, would only disappoint his boss. Ma Yan looked at his interlocutor in bewilderment and pursed his lips angrily. He really wanted to boast about his achievements. Cheng Yan noticed the boy's hesitation and smiled, asking him to tell them about it when they started making money. It would raise their standing in the boss's eyes. Ma Yan scratched his chin thoughtfully. He now understood that now was not the time to boast about minor successes. The young men shook hands in a sign of mutual understanding. Ma Yan said that they really should hold off on the news. While Pei Qian was enjoying the silence and delicious coffee, his henchmen were preparing a pleasant surprise for the boss. The trip to the new internet cafe could be considered a success. Pei Qian returned to the office in good spirits. The man's first action was to turn on his laptop and check his corporate email. He needed to keep a closer eye on his employees' expenses. A few minutes later, the chief planner sent over a progress report. Pei Qian reviewed it and was satisfied. He had reason to rejoice. The latest changes to his MMORPG had reduced his balance replenishment income by 80%. There was a soft knock on the office door. Pei Qian asked the visitor to come in. He was free to talk. A beaming Huang Shibo appeared at the door. The man was surprised. He hadn't heard anything about Fei Huang Film Studio in a long time. The visitor placed a small suitcase on the table, which had the company logo with 3 red apples on it. Smiling, Huang Xibo admitted that he had been passing by their office and decided to stop by for a visit and say goodbye. Pei Qian looked at his guest in bewilderment and asked again. He assumed the young man needed to leave urgently. Huang Xibo said he was leaving for Shanghai with Director Zhu. He will likely remain there until next month. Pei Qian smiled and said it was a good place. He had already mentally calculated the cost of travel and accommodation. Sighing, the man wished Huang Xibo a good journey, and also asked why it was necessary to film the movie there. The guy scratched his head and timidly admitted he hadn't wanted to tell the truth. With a subject like that, the film probably wouldn't make money at all. Pei Qian smiled happily. If it came to losses, he was willing to invest even a few million. The man jumped up from the table and shook his guest's wrists, cordially offering to talk a little before leaving. The surprised Huang Xibo hadn't even had time to sit down on the sofa when Pei Qian quickly brought him some tea, deciding to treat the employee. He thanked his boss and took the cup. The man asked for more details on why the project was considered unprofitable. He said that the film crew decided to make a short documentary for themselves and settled on the topic of esports. Pei Qian asked in surprise. He didn't understand why Gao Che needed to make a film about esports athletes. The boy stood in bewildered silence. He imagined a cyber athlete with a broken nose sleeping on newspaper sheets next to trash cans. The second cyber sportsman seemed to him to be a suspicious character in a dark hood who could only afford instant noodles. Even the real esports athletes in the special room didn't seem real. Pei Qian knew no one would be interested. Huang Xibo lowered his head and muttered that he had already prepared himself for the worst. No one would want to advertise it. Pei Qian placed his hand firmly on the employee's shoulder. Huang Xibo looked up in confusion, sensing something was about to happen. The man said there was no need to worry about money. He was giving the film studio complete freedom of action. Huang Xibo nearly burst into tears of happiness. He exclaimed that he had secretly hoped for his boss's support, but hadn't dared ask for it. Pei Qian clenched his fist, shaking the air, and declared that money meant nothing in this situation. They would go to the very end. The visitor said they planned to travel to Shanghai by economy train. They would also save on accommodation and food. Pei Chen looked at the employee in bewilderment. His saving could ruin the wonderful plan for spending money. The man asked Huang Xibo in bewilderment why he had decided to skimp on housing and food for the film crew. The strange tone startled the boy a little. Stuttering, he said that in such cases, it was customary to watch one's spending. Pei Chen angrily pointed his finger at the guest and shouted fiercely that every employee, including Huang Xibo, must clearly know their place. The boy's hands shook so violently that the cup almost fell out of his hands. A few drops of tea spilled onto the floor. Pei Chen began to nervously pace around the office, explaining that it was impossible to ride the green economy class train, as trouble could happen. He angrily stated that the lack of good nutrition and proper sleep could have a negative impact on filming, and the movie would be a failure. Huang Xibo stood up from the sofa and raised his hands, trying to explain that he didn't want any bad consequences and was simply cutting costs. Pei Chen demanded that the group fly to Shanghai and back. In the film industry, every minute is precious. He added that there was no need to rush the film. It had to be high quality. If money was needed, Huang Xibo would get it. The guy thanked his boss joyfully, clenching his fists. He was pleased that everything had worked out so well. Now he didn't have to skimp. Pei Chen sighed wearily and reminded Huang Xibo that they had been working together for a long time. There was no need to worry about money. The guy smiled and exclaimed that he realized his mistake. From now on, the film studio would adhere to Tengda's standards. The man folded his arms and smiled, declaring that this was the right decision. If any problems arose, all he had to do was call him. As Huang Xibo headed for the exit, Pei Chen's expression darkened again. It had taken him a great deal of effort to convince the young man not to skimp on anything. Closing his eyes, the Tengda company boss sighed heavily. He had to find ways to lose money every day in order to profit from the system. The man glared out the window. If everyone simply followed his orders, he would have gone bankrupt long ago. Pei Chen looked at the sun from his window, praying to the heavens that at least one of his ventures would fail. Deciding to take a little rest, Pei Chen launched his favorite TV series on his laptop and leisurely nibbled on a red apple. The sun's rays still streamed through the window, shining directly into his face. The man covered himself with a blanket, peering at the screen. Suddenly he felt his right eye begin to twitch, and he became wary. Pei Chen didn't connect it with the source of the irritation outside the window. Rubbing his right eyelid, he immediately remembered an old proverb. Since ancient times, people have believed that a twitching right eye means trouble. The man walked to the window and looked out at the city. Everything had returned to normal. The young man decided his eyes were too tired from watching TV series. Pei Chen sensed that all was not well. Instead of his right eye, his left eye was now twitching, which was not good. He rubbed his left eyelid with his fist, reassuring himself that this was much better. A twitching left eye portends wealth. Pei Chen was startled when he realized that in his case, even increasing his wealth would still mean disaster. He began pacing nervously, sensing trouble. He dreamed of profits at the cafe. The new branches had just opened and were failing to generate income. The man realized there was no time to waste. He needed to check immediately. He grabbed the phone and dialed the number, but only short beeps came from the receiver. Pei Chen contacted Shin's assistant and demanded that she take him to the internet cafe urgently. He needed to check something. The Jizu district was incredibly beautiful at night. Neon signs glowed everywhere, attracting visitors. Moyu's cafe's profits grew at an astronomical rate. Sound equipment was installed in the dining room, and waiters moved some of the chairs outside. Now visitors could sit in a summer cafe and listen to their favorite singer, enjoying the evening air. Mayan took the cocktail and turned towards the entrance, cheerfully telling his partner that they had successfully resolved the issue of the lack of seats in the hall. Cheng Yuan cheerfully gave the thumbs up. He agreed that the idea was excellent. Now all the customers were happy. The girl's hand slapped the bar counter, clutching 200 yuan bills. 4 rings adorned her fingers. The brunette asked for 3 cocktails, and 2 of them were to be given to Chen Lei on behalf of Xiaomi, who was in love with him. The bartender smiled and promised to bring the order as soon as possible. The girl demanded that the cocktail be taken to the singer first. Smiling shyly, Xiaomi went back to her table. Her companions immediately noticed her and stared after her for a long moment. The young men exchanged knowing glances. The brunette was very attractive, and they both liked her immediately. Zhang Yuan exclaimed that they could start making money as early as next month. Ma Yan was pleased to finally prove he could work as well as Huang Xibo. Just then, Huang Xibo sneezed loudly. The boy suddenly felt like someone was talking about him. Zhang Yuan suggested that Chen Lei's activities be expanded to other cafe branches so that they could start earning money faster. Ma Yan immediately imagined Pei Chen thanking him and stated that in that case, they could tell the boss everything once all three cafes started making a profit. Moreover, he saw himself as a winner at the awards ceremony for the best employee of Tengda Company. After passing the entertainment venues, the yellow SUV stopped in a residential area. It was relatively quiet here, with several dozen buildings still lit up. As soon as Pei Chen got out of the car, he realized something was wrong. Loud music was playing from the cafe. Moyu's cafe was always deserted, but now customers were sitting under its umbrellas even in front of the entrance. At first, the man didn't understand what was happening. Several dozen people were relaxing in front of his cafe, drinking. Pei Qian's consciousness refused to believe that these people in his Moyu cafe were connected. This couldn't be possible. The young man clutched his head. He'd expected to find a large, empty cafe here, but this was a complete failure. Pei Qian angrily headed toward the cafe. He had to figure out what was going on here. Assistant Shin gasped in surprise as she surveyed the outdoor cafe. Unfortunately, the internet cafe itself was just as crowded with customers as the outside. Every table was occupied. A pop singer was singing on stage, and a huge screen behind him announced to all the visitors that Xiaomi had given him 2 cocktails. His charisma attracted young female patrons. 3 admiring girlfriends decided to give the performer a drink too. Hailey was pleasantly surprised that the internet cafe manager was able to achieve such a stunning success in just 1 week. She smiled, realizing that the success of Cafe Moyu would be followed by the rise of other branches. Their fame would quickly grow. The girl looked thoughtfully at her boss and remembered how he'd been oblivious to the cafe's massive losses. She realized Pei Qian had foreseen this day. Hailu couldn't know what was going on in the boss's head. He was barely holding back a scream and shaking with anger. Pei Qian clenched his fists and frowned as he approached Ma Yan, who cheerfully exclaimed that this was not the ceiling. They could earn even more. The irritated man couldn't help but look at Zhang Yuan's satisfied face, who was sitting opposite Ma Yan. The young man continued to discuss the cafe's prospects. Zhang Yuan noticed the boss's unkind expression and asked in a frightened voice why he had come. Ma Yan realized Pei Chen had arrived and turned a joyful face toward him. He was so pleased that he didn't notice the looming threat. Laughing, the young man admitted that he wanted to make a pleasant surprise, but the boss somehow found out everything himself. Pei Chen angrily shouted that he had a wonderful internet cafe, but it had been turned into a laughingstock. Ma Yan looked at his boss in fear. He muttered excitedly that there was no need to worry so much. It wouldn't be long before their Moyu cafe would start making money. The man was so angry he couldn't even speak. The worst part was that his best friend kept rubbing salt into the wound. Unable to bear it, Pei Qian angrily shouted, shaking his index finger, that he had arrived on time and that his wonderful cafe had not yet been ruined. He angrily exclaimed that the manager had violated management strategy and damaged the image of Tengda Company. Ma Yan looked at his boss in fear. The guy put his hand on his boss's shoulder, asking him to step aside to talk. He had never seen his friend so furious. The manager sat down on the sofa in the office opposite the boss. Pei Qian sat with his arms folded across his chest. His hate-filled eyes glared angrily at the young men. Both tried to smile. Ma Yan scratched his head in confusion, asking for someone to point out his mistake if he'd done anything wrong. Pei Chen angrily calculated in his mind that according to his plan, the 5 internet cafes he opened would generate a loss of 1 million per month. The problem was that the other 4 cafes would sooner or later follow the example of the main cafe, which would lead to disaster. Pei Chen couldn't admit to Ma Yan why he was so angry about any profit, and he became even more furious because of it. Pulling himself together, the boss sighed heavily and reminded the head manager that he was forgetting the most important thing. Moyu's internet cafe needs to make money, but that's not the most important thing. The establishment's primary concern is maintaining Tengda's reputation. Pei Chen angrily pointed to the street and angrily exclaimed that their internet cafe looked more like an open-air stall in this state. Ma Yan awkwardly twirled his index fingers in an apologetic gesture and quietly muttered that he wanted to create the atmosphere of a European town. The boss towered over his subordinate and shouted angrily that it was no different from a stall. The young man admitted that it looked like a European stall. Pei Chen angrily asked what Tengda's image was. He cited a proverb, but misinterpreted it out of spite. He tried to pretend it was the way things should be. Fortunately, the companions were completely distracted. The young men exchanged fearful glances. They mentally signaled to each other. Zhang Yuan indicated they'd made a mistake somewhere. Ma Yan had the same confused expression on his face. The bartender frowned, indicating Ma Yan was more friendly with the boss. He closed his eyes and sighed heavily. This meant he would do everything. The young man folded his palms in supplication and asked what would happen to the cafe now. He promised to carry out any order the boss gave him. Peikan bowed his head, propping it up with his hand. The man sighed. He would have been happier if the cafe had returned to its original level of profitability. Under these circumstances, there was no choice but to hold an urgent meeting in their heads to save the cafe. 5 clones gathered around a round table. The chairman banged his gavel on the table and sighed, asking who would like to speak first this time. Peikan, wearing square glasses, immediately raised his hand and loudly exclaimed that he was ready to share his thoughts. Standing up, he angrily slammed his palms on the table, reminding them that losing money was not an easy task and they needed to figure it out. Peichen, with a cup of tea, reasonably noted that the customers had already settled in the cafe, and it would be wrong to get rid of them. The doppelganger with the joystick raised his hand and suggested clearing the tables in front of the cafe. Scientist Pei Qian angrily asked where he would seat the customers then. The clone with the red bow tie said they could get rid of the singer and his interest. The scientist said they had no reason to do so. The chairman angrily slammed his gavel on the table, exclaiming that half measures were not enough. Evil must be destroyed. Peikin demanded that the managers first remove the screen. Once the number of customers dwindled, the outdoor tables would be returned to the dining room. Ma Yan was willing to do anything to keep his boss from getting angry. He forced a pitiful smile and promised to do everything he could. Peikin turned his gaze to Zhang Yuan and asked him to bring the singer for a chat. He bowed and said he understood. As soon as Zhang Yuan took Chen Lei off stage, the hall instantly emptied. Without soulful music, no one wanted to sit there. The young man introduced the singer to his boss. Pei Qian looked closely at the source of his failure. When Zhang Yuan introduced the young man, he smiled sheepishly. Pei Qian knew he had to deal with the pop singer. Chen Lei shook the man's hand and greeted him. The man returned the greeting and smiled, telling him that he had heard about him from Ma Yan. Pei Qian invited the boy to sit down. Zhang Yuan was glad to leave as quickly as possible and said he had to get to his duties. The man told the singer that he should consider pursuing a music career. Shanghai would be ideal for realizing his dream. Chen Lei waved his hands awkwardly and admitted that this city was too far from home. His parents would not agree. Looking down, the young man quietly said that Shanghai was very expensive to live in. He'd starve to death before he could find a job. Pei Qian laughed. He folded his arms across his chest, waving his fingers in protest, and exclaimed that Chen Lei was underestimating himself. The man began praising his singing, declaring that even with just one note, he could knock everyone out, and that many girls wanted to be with him. The young man was pleased by the flattery, and he began to think. When Pei Qian said that Chen Lei would find himself faster in a big city, the boy already saw himself on stage in a crowded concert hall. The man declared that in a few years, the singer would return home with honor. Chen Lei smiled shyly, imagining all the honors. Pei Qian mentally triumphed. He'd immediately crack the ordinary-looking guy. Of course, he always wanted recognition. Chen Lei looked confused. He knew he had to solve the boy's personal problems to get him to leave for Shanghai. He wanted to allocate funds on behalf of the company, but the system did not allow the transaction because Chen Lei was not officially employed there. Pei Qian thought for a moment. He couldn't fire the guy either. He'd done a lot of good for the Moyu Internet Cafe. The man said that he could help the boy if he really wanted to devote his whole life to music. He explained that Fei Huang's studio, part of Tengda, is currently located in Shanghai. Chen Lei could work with them. The young man asked in surprise what the studio's name was. He hadn't heard anything about Fei Huang's company before that day. Pei Qian smiled and promised that this was only a temporary measure, and in the meantime, the boy would be able to realize his dream. The offer was too generous. Chen Lei smiled sheepishly and admitted he couldn't answer right away. He needed to think about it. During Chen Lei's absence, the flow of customers had dropped significantly, and only a few people were standing near the empty tables outside. The singer returned to his place on stage, but his voice no longer sounded as inspired as before. Chen Lei seemed to be trying to hide his face and lowered his head. He felt that he was betraying the cafe patrons who had fallen in love with him, and he closed his eyes so as not to look at them. The clients noticed strange changes and immediately realized they would have to part with their beloved pet. One of the girls decided to give him 2 cocktails. Mustering up his courage, Chen Lei loudly declared that he had something to say. He couldn't speak in this place any longer. All the visitors began asking him what had happened. The girls were practically crying and begging him to stay. The man raised his hand, calling for silence. He declared that he had come to love the place and his audience and thanked everyone for their attention. Shannel hesitated and explained that he was going to Shanghai to become a famous singer. The cafe's management had given him this advice. The red-haired beauty nearly burst into tears, realizing this was their last meeting. Her neighbor also immediately became sad. Shannel turned away, secretly wiping away a traitorous tear. The singer expressed hope that the audience would forgive him. The girls cried, unable to contain their emotions. One fan, through her tears, said she'd buy another cocktail as a farewell wish for a safe journey. Tycoon chose to stay out of Shanley's sight and watched from the street. He saw how much everyone loved the singer. The man sighed. He himself didn't want to commit such a terrible act, but Shanley truly deserved better. Ma Yan couldn't stay away either. He didn't come out into the hall and instead cried on the sidelines, lamenting that he was left without a money tree. Tycoon sneaked past, taking advantage of the fact that Zhang Yuan was calming his friend down and promising to find a new singer. The man looked at his friend in surprise. He couldn't believe Ma Yan was so upset about the guitarist. Tycoon put an arm around the boy's shoulder and explained that Shanley's talent would only be wasted in this cafe. It was best to wish him luck. Sobbing, Ma Yan wiped his tears with a handkerchief and admitted he was worried about something else. The cafe could now lose its income. Tycoon thought happily that things weren't so bad after all. Ma Yan had stumbled upon the singer completely by chance. He could be trusted. The man walked around his friend and placed both hands on his shoulders, looking him in the eye. Tycoon declared that he shouldn't focus on making money. He said that Ma Yan should only think about maintaining the image of Tengda Company in every possible way. He wiped his tear-stained eyes and muttered that he understood everything. He would now pay more attention to his work. The waiters lined up inside the cafe, bidding farewell to the singer. Shanley quietly conversed with Tycoon. The man quickly scribbled Huang Sibo's name and number on a piece of paper with a red pen, asking him to find the man after arriving in Shanghai. Assistant Shin waited patiently by the car for her boss. She'd heard that the singer would be helped with everything he needed in Shanghai. Shanley clasped Tycoon's hand in his palm and thanked him warmly for everything, exclaiming that he would repay all the expenses when he could. The man laughed. No need to do that. What he really wanted was for the guy to come to Shanghai quickly and start spending his money. On June 3rd, Tycoon came to check on the second cafe. The premises were empty, with a few people standing outside. The young man was pleased. No one was even thinking of coming here. All 5 cafes were now expected to be consistently losing money. With Shanley gone, a new problem arose. Ma Yan withdrew into himself and refused to talk to anyone. Even Zhang Yuan couldn't cheer him up. When Ma Yan turned his head and looked at the boss, Tycoon felt like he was looking at a zombie with glassy eyes. He carefully questioned Zhang Yuan about what was going on. He explained that it most closely resembled a mild depression. The man didn't know how to cheer up Ma Yan and asked the manager how things were going at the main internet cafe. Zhang Yuan bowed his head dejectedly, admitting that the number of visitors had dwindled. Even finding a new singer hadn't helped. Sighing, the guy added that he still takes a cut of the drinks. Unfortunately, this doesn't really help the cafe's growth. Tycoon was wary. He immediately realized that sooner or later, a percentage of sales would make the cafe profitable. The man kept racking his brains, trying to find some useful activity for Ma Yan, and at the same time take a percentage of the sales. He remembered appointing the cook as manager of the cafe. Tycoon thought hard. He felt he was on the right track. Suddenly, the only correct solution that would please everyone formed in his head. The man raised his hand and loudly called Ma Yan to him, exclaiming that there was a new and very important task for him. The boy immediately turned his face in surprise, interrupting his conversation with the cook. Ma Yan couldn't believe they'd found him a new assignment. Forgetting about his interlocutors, the joyful manager rushed to his boss, asking what this important task was. Tycoon raised his index finger, declaring that Ma Yan would have to expand the territory of Moyu Internet Cafe. All 3 looked at their boss in bewilderment. The man exclaimed that this was a major strategic move for the Tengda business empire. Tycoon imagined a variety of salads and appetizers. He spread his arms, declaring that it was time to take over the food business. The man decided not to postpone the meeting. The 4 men sat down at a table by the window in the restaurant run by the chef. Zhang Yuan introduced the man to his boss. Lin Kanzhong bowed warmly to the Tengda company director. Tycoon smiled broadly and said he was glad to be here for this meeting. His face expressed calm. Zhang Yuan coughed into his fist and timidly said that Kanzhong used to work more slowly, But now he was forced to try harder. The chef himself could barely contain his grin. In fact, it was the other way around. Now he only cooked dinners for the company and spent the rest of his time simply bored. The man understood that with such a turnover, profit was out of the question. Even more strange was his boss's decision to take a position in food supply. Tycoon imagined tables groaning, with an abundance of salads and appetizers. He declared that people only needed food and pleasure for the eyes. The chef blinked in confusion, trying to follow his boss's logic. He said the cafe had previously promoted drinks to please customers. Now their task has become more difficult. They need to ensure that those who have never been to the cafe can enjoy the delicacies. Zhang Yuan froze. Ma Yan shook his head in bewilderment, assuming that such a strange formulation was hiding ordinary takeout food. Tycoon claimed that wasn't the case at all. He sarcastically reminded his friend of how he had struggled to find his calling in the pop scene. As soon as Ma Yan took the microphone, the audience rushed out. Shenlei immediately captivated the audience. The local beauties couldn't be torn away from the stage. Drumming his fingers on the table, Tycoon thoughtfully explained that in the future he would sell takeaway food in all major cities of the country. Only now did his three interlocutors fully embrace the boss's idea and look at him with undisguised admiration. The chef finally understood the man's grand plan. It wasn't just about selling takeout. Tycoon wanted to create a trading empire. Zhang Yuan burst into tears as it all dawned on him. Only a true genius could have come up with such a brilliant idea. Ma Yan stood up from the table, placing his hands on its surface, smiling. The young man asked impatiently what their next move would be. Zhang Yuan asked if they could launch a takeout website. The partners smiled at each other. Tycoon smiled as he saw the three men animatedly discussing their new project. He knew his venture would soon become a trend. Buying takeaway food is of no interest to anyone now. Entrepreneurs will only develop this area in a year. The man reached for his hot coffee. His idea was simple. Connect food suppliers to the site and charge a fee for the intermediary's services. Tycoon knew this was the surest path to profit. He needed to slow down. He asked his interlocutors to take their time. The man explained that they could create a website, but they didn't have their own brand yet. All three of them turned around in surprise. No one had thought of that. Tycoon stated that suppliers also need to be chosen carefully to avoid poisoning customers with poor quality food. Ma Yan scratched his head in confusion. This no longer seemed so simple. He worriedly asked where to begin. The man snapped his fingers and said that the first thing to do was to create a brand and a simple app where people could order only their branded products. He imagined three chefs in crisp white uniforms. Their fruits and vegetables would always be fresh and clean. Tycoon showed China on the globe and declared that their empire from Beizhou would quickly spread throughout the country. Kanzhong timidly countered that many cafes now sell takeaway food, so it would be difficult to compete with them. The chef explained that large restaurants had a clear advantage over them in advertising and pricing. Tycoon smiled faintly. He already knew this. The man frowned. He had to admit, the head chef was all too aware of the state of the food industry. Tycoon smiled and said he'd go his own way. Other organizations use unhygienic packaging, and their food comes in plastic. He explained that people perceive everything visually when purchasing things. For them, a beautiful packaging is sometimes more important than the product itself. The man dreamily stated that all their products would be supplied in exclusive white porcelain dishes. Kanzhong hesitated and whispered to Zhang Yuan if it was possible. Zhang Yuan replied that he had complete confidence in his boss. Tycoon announced that he was appointing the chef to oversee the experimental delivery of food from their cafe. He eagerly stood at attention, accepting the order. The man tasked two partners with creating a food delivery website. Everything should be up and running by next week. Ma Yan stepped forward and slapped his chest, proudly declaring that he could handle this task better than anyone else. Tycoon stretched his arms upward, yawning widely. He had been very tired for a long time and only now allowed himself to relax. The young man raised his hand and shouted to the chief planner that he had forwarded the documentation. Ming Liang smiled and indicated that everything was in order. Takeout food was delivered to the office and they were asked to choose an order. The development team was stunned, which was very welcome. Tycoon raised his head and said in surprise that the uniforms on the couriers now looked much more attractive. There was indeed reason to be surprised. The Moyu Cafe logo was emblazoned on the blue helmet, and the courier was holding a signature brown takeout container. Each helmet was decorated differently, but the couriers themselves wore the same uniform, which included a light blue t-shirt and dark sweatpants. The couriers placed the enormous boxes on the table and pulled out several containers of food. Yikun recalled that just yesterday, the delivery team had been wearing different outfits. The entire table was filled with all sorts of salads and drinks. The hungry developers were simply spoiled for choice. The couple each grabbed a container of food. They smiled when they heard a real fight going on at the table behind them over who would get what. Yikun grabbed a small piece of meat with his chopsticks, eager to get a better taste of the new food. All the dishes were superb. The writer realized that this batch had been prepared no worse than by a restaurant chef. The young man was very pleased. The food was delicious and healthy. There were sausages and a few cookies left for dessert. The delivery girl wished the developers bon appetit. She asked them to put the used dishes together. Other people would come and collect them. The employees were surprised to hear about the new delivery service and the quality food. They were very lucky with their place of work. Ming Liang sat down at Yi Kun's table and admitted that he had intended to cook such food himself. But this food was much tastier. The writer looked at the contents of the porcelain container and asked how much such a portion might cost. The man, perplexed, replied that it would be no more than 20 won. Bao Shu approached them and reminded them that the dishes had to be returned, so there would be at least 30. Yikun said it was too expensive for a simple meal. Ming Liang cut him off with displeasure. Pei Qian only does this for his own people. Bao Shu opened a bottle of cola and thoughtfully said that the boss was just about to open a similar site. Even the names were very similar. Lin Wan sat alone at a table, enjoying a delicious meal. A glass of cold lemonade stood next to her. The girl angrily thought that their boss was treating the team too well, but no one wanted to notice it. She looked thoughtfully at her phone screen. Lin Wan wanted to repay Pei Qian for his boundless generosity. Finally, June 18th arrived. The developers were pleased to have met the deadline, and now they could take a little rest. The new add-on from Tengda has appeared in all digital stores, and hundreds of users have installed the latest mobile version. Pei Qian closely monitored the expansion's sales. He wasn't pleased to see so many people buying the new product. The man decided to join a new game server, hoping to encounter a lot of negative comments. The forum was full of comments. Pei Qian grinned when he realized his games were being trashed. The section where video reviews of the game were posted confused the young man a little. It turned out that Lao Shi had posted a new video. At first, everything was quite tolerable. Teacher Chow criticized the game's small budget and the shoddily applied textures. Unfortunately, the man gradually began to praise the game and admitted he was wrong. He was enthusiastically playing the driving simulator and praised the latest update. Immediately afterward, the forum was filled with positive posts. Pei Qian groaned, but Teacher Chow again set him up with praise. He slammed his palm on the table angrily, thinking angrily that Lao Shi was like an eternal evil and was appearing nearby at the wrong moment. Pei Qian clenched his fists angrily. He decided not to let things slide this time and to deal with the one who was ruining his business. The man scratched his chin dejectedly. He didn't know how to make Lao Shi stay put. Force was out of the question. He felt the white telephone receiver behind his back and reluctantly reached for it. Thinking over his plan of action, Pei Qian demanded that Assistant Shin assign 2 people to find detailed information about Lao Shi. At that very moment, Teacher Chow flinched. Feeling a gust of wind behind him, he assumed the air conditioner was to blame. Since June 20th, Pei Qian had been poring over his textbooks. There wasn't much time left before exams. It was difficult to constantly sit over notes. The man raised his head and sighed heavily. Studying was difficult. He was deeply envious of Ma Yan, knowing that the boy studied and worked at the same time. Of course, he would pass his exams without any problems. The cell phone on the table vibrated. A new notification had arrived. Pei Qian picked it up, puzzled, and looked at the screen. The lead planner reported that one of the local newspapers had done a glowing report on their latest expansion for the game. Min Liang was delighted that they were even being discussed on Weibo. Pei Qian thought wryly that it wasn't a problem. Popularity comes and goes. But the news that accounts from their games were being sold on the black market for 2,000 made the man wary. He angrily threw the phone on the table, promising himself that he wouldn't let more than 500 accounts be created, and returned to his textbook. At that moment, an email notification beeped in the lower right corner of the monitor. Pei Qian looked up from his textbook with displeasure. If he was constantly disturbed, he wouldn't be able to repeat anything. It was the chief planner again. He emailed me a screenshot from the forum. It turned out the games had even received recognition on the official platform. Pei Qian slowly lowered the textbook, unable to hold it any longer. Sweat began to appear in his face. The man reached for his phone and carefully reread the latest news in the gaming world, hoping it was a mistake. He called the chief planner in bewilderment, reminded them that the official platform had already recommended their games on the main page. Min Liang cheerfully explained that, as a sign of support, the middleman had agreed to keep 30% instead of 50. These words struck Pei Xian like lightning. The empire, as solid as a monolith, began to crumble at the seams. The chief planner couldn't calm down. According to the digital store, profits could reach as high as 90%. Pei Qian couldn't bear it any longer. The phone fell from his weakened hand. The man stared ahead in shock. He rose angrily from the table, slamming his fist on it. Everything wasn't going according to plan, and besides, he still had exams to study for. The man realized he couldn't continue reviewing the material today. He called a car to take him to the office. Yikin and the chief planner were the first to see the boss and simultaneously raised their heads, happily greeting him. They noticed that Pei Qian was walking around the office with a stony expression today. As if the company's profits didn't surprise him, the boss and his assistant, Xin, walked into the office. The man sat down at the desk and began carefully studying the company's current status report. He paled as he calculated that the Ocean Fortress was bringing in $3.5 million in revenue. And that wasn't the limit. Thoughtfully leafing through the report, Pei Qian remembered that the next results review would take place in just a week. By then, he'd be 70 million richer. The man flipped through the report to the last page and placed it on the table, firmly declaring that the company must expand. Pei Qian demanded that new staff be hired for all positions starting next month, without limiting the number of positions. Hailu quickly wrote down all the boss's demands. The girl also made a suggestion. The first floor is too empty. A few tables could be added. Pei Qian, surprised, folded his arms and replied that he intended to provide employees with spacious and comfortable space. In his opinion, the first floor was already overcrowded. Hailu looked at her boss in bewilderment, but didn't argue, and quickly made the appropriate entries in her diary. Pei Qian asked his assistant to talk to the landlord about renting an additional floor. Renovations and furniture would need to be purchased. The girl promised to talk to Director Zhang and asked whether Pei Qian needed to see the contents of the contract. He waved her off and said he trusted the assistant. He asked her to inform the landlord that he would like to pay 3 months in advance. Hailu asked if there were any other requests. Pei Qian asked her to contact the landlord as soon as possible and pay the rent. The assistant turned to leave. At times, she couldn't understand her boss. The man frowned as she left. Pei Qian breathed a sigh of relief, calculating that the new rent had cost 18 million straight away. Replacing the furniture on the first floor would cost another 10. Unfortunately, there was still a lot of money left over. It needed to be spent quickly in a way that would look beneficial to the employees. Pei Qian recalled that Fei Huang Film Studio had expanded its staff by several dozen. The Moyu Cafe had also managed to increase its staff. The man estimated that Shangyang's recently acquired company had about 50 employees. He decided to let them handle the spending themselves. Pei Qian's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Assistant Xin brought a signed lease for the entire floor. The man smiled as he explained that he was planning to raise his employees' salaries. They would also receive 1,000 rubles each for rent. Haley was pleased to hear this. She joyfully exclaimed in response that kindness will be repaid to a noble man. Pei Qian immediately stopped smiling and asked in confusion how to understand Assistant Shin's words. Hailu raised her hand and said she had some very good news regarding the rent. Director Zhang was very pleased with their cooperation. Raising an exclamation finger, the girl said that they were exempted from all expenses and even had their rent reduced by half. Pei Qian became furious and indignantly declared that this was very suspicious. No landlord would do this. Shin's assistant pretended not to hear him and happily continued to tell him how they'd managed to save 400,000. The man felt his back begin to sweat. He couldn't believe that even in such a loss-making business as rent, he managed to make a huge profit. Pei Qian asked fearfully if the girl had made a deal. She admitted that she had wanted to, but Director Zhang had prevented it. The man frowned, resting his chin on his palms. He understood that Director Zhang was only responsible for the building and didn't want to lower the price himself. Pei Qian stood up from the table, bracing himself with his hands. He consoled himself with the thought that these 400,000 could be spent elsewhere. The man headed for the exit. He declared that this was all too suspicious and that he needed to talk to the landlord. Assistant Shin thoughtfully admitted that she, too, was confused by Director Zhang's generous offer. Pei Qian realized this wasn't just paranoia, since his assistant was also surprised. He decided to conduct his own investigation. The man smiled. He could already see himself walking into the landlord's office and forcing him to sign the contract under the previous terms. At that moment, there was a knock at the door. Pei Qian turned his head toward the door in surprise, inviting the visitor in. It turned out to be one of the administrator twins. Winking at Hai Liu, the girl handed her a basket of fruit. The basket's handle was tied with a red bow. Taking the basket, Assistant Shin said that Director Zhang would definitely lower the salary now. They should thank the man personally. Pei Qian asked irritably what was going on. He angrily shouted that he hadn't intended to go to the director to ask him for a pay cut. Unfortunately, there was nowhere to go. The boss and his smiling assistant took the elevator up to Director Zhang's office. The man was sitting alone in his office and was just engaged in important negotiations with a client via email. When there was a knock on the door, he looked up in surprise. As far as he knew, there shouldn't be any visitors at this hour. Upon seeing one of his best clients, Director Zhang jumped up from his desk in surprise and greeted him. The man ran to the door and hospitably invited the distinguished guests into the office. The assistant smiled. Director Zhang was pacing around the office, eager to please the guests. Pei Qian shook his head in surprise, trying to follow him. Hai Liu placed a basket of fruit on the table, saying that the boss wanted to thank her for lowering the rent. Pei Qian noticed Director Zhang and Assistant Shin glaring at him from both sides. He hesitantly confirmed the girl's words. The man said it shouldn't have been done. They were honored to partner with Tengda. Pei Qian looked at his interlocutor in surprise. Director Zhang beamed with happiness and declared that he was supposed to be visiting the client. Pei Qian thought with irritation that their meeting was not going at all as he had planned from the very beginning. Clearing his throat delicately into his fist, the man confidently stated that Director Zhang should not have actually lowered the salary. He stood there, unsure how to explain everything. Under Pei Qian's stern gaze, Director Zhang felt uncomfortable and began to sweat. Scratching his head, he timidly admitted that he himself didn't understand anything. This order came from higher-ups. Director Zhang said he didn't even know who exactly made the decision to lower the rent. Pei Qian looked at him in surprise. He had hoped to resolve this issue quickly, but now he realized it would be difficult. The man paused for thought. Director Zhang chatted cheerfully with the Qin's assistant. It seemed he genuinely had nothing to do with the rent reduction. Only the top management of Zhang's company remained. Pei Qian assumed they belonged to the gaming community. Returning to the office, the man, after a short search, discovered that Shenhua's company was run by Lin Zhou. Pei Qian thoughtfully read the reports on his laptop, hoping to find at least one clue. Unfortunately, most of the information mentioned the company's real estate. The man suddenly realized the name Lin sounded familiar. A wealthy woman with the same last name worked at Tengda's company. The image of a smiling Lin Wan appeared before his eyes. Pei Qian couldn't believe the influence she had on his relatives. The man angrily grabbed his head, cursing the girl's kindness. There were no other options. It was definitely her doing. Pei Qian stood up from his desk, remembering his conversation with his assistant. Hai Liu had mentioned that Lin Wan had no work experience. He paced the office, recreating everything from memory. When Lin Wan took over player communications, Ocean Fortress sales soared. At the time, Pei Qian didn't pay much attention to her, considering her simply a wealthy employee. Unfortunately, he made a serious mistake. Lin Wan seemed like an angel with a ton of money. With just one phone call, she was able to lower the rent. Pei Qian plopped down wearily into his chair, close to tears. He thought with frustration that the situation was very complicated and needed to be handled delicately. The man tried to calm down. First, he needed to find out the girl's purpose. Most likely, she simply came to gain experience. Pei Qian scratched his head thoughtfully. Perhaps, a little later, she herself would leave the company to start her own business. He pulled out his phone, determined to gather at least some information about Lin Wan. Then he might be able to understand her intentions. Pei Qian dialed Zhou Muyan's number. He knew that Lin Wan had previously worked at Tianhuo Studio, and the boy might know her. The man had to wait for a while until a sleepy Mu Yan answered his call with a sluggish voice. Mu Yan's face paled upon hearing his interlocutor's voice. He knew full well that Pei Qian was very cunning and was only pretending to know nothing. The man was now sitting in his office, trying to figure out what the director of the Tengda company needed this time. He recalled their first meeting. Even then, Pei Qian had begun to experience difficulties. But he stubbornly pretended nothing was happening. At meetings and gatherings, the man applauded heartily, like everyone else, but his face remained inscrutable. Mu Yan sighed heavily and asked how he could help. He'd already reflected that in the gaming industry, all companies occasionally overlap. Pei Qian scratched his head and smiled, saying that he would like to know more about the identity of the girl named Lin Wan. He asked in surprise how Pei Qian could not know this. He himself remembered very well the call from the Shenhua company office. These hints only angered Pei Qian. He took it to mean that Lin Wan was a complicated girl, and Mu Yan simply didn't want to talk about it. The man admitted that he had encountered some difficulties at work, which is why he turned to him for help. Mu Yan smiled and exclaimed that he saw no problem and was ready to do everything in his power. Pei Qian asked about Lin Wan's family and her path in the gaming industry. Mu Yan pushed his glasses up his nose. He was quite surprised that Pei Qian didn't know this. After graduating, Lin Wan founded Tianhuo Studios because she was interested in video games. Her father didn't like this very much. They argued constantly. The angry girl left home, and Lin Zhennan contacted him to maintain contact with his daughter. Mu Yan sighed heavily. He confessed to his interlocutor that he could tell him nothing more about the beautiful Lin Wan. Pei Qian asked how Lin Wan and Lin Zhou felt about each other. He replied that she only felt hostility toward her father. Pei Qian realized what had happened. Lin Wan had likely called her brother and asked him to lower the rent for his company. The man asked if she could return and inherit the millions. Mu Yan thoughtfully replied that to do so, she would have to leave the gaming industry. Pei Qian sincerely thanked his interlocutor and promised to come and personally reward him for his invaluable assistance. Mu Yan was afraid that he was going to be punished and muttered fearfully that Lin Wan could not have caused great harm to the company. The two men looked at each other in silence. Pei Qian considered how to present the information to Mu Yan without him becoming suspicious. He said sullenly that Lin Wan had managed to get the rent reduced, and now he was paying 1.5 million instead of 4. Mu Yan grinned. He didn't know why this news infuriated Pei Qian, but he knew it was a generous gift. Pei Qian sighed wearily as he ended the call. He continued to stare at the phone screen, unconsciously processing the information he'd received. The man realized he'd reached a dead end. If he started paying his employees more money, Lin Wan would definitely not want to leave. Pei Qian drummed his fingers on the table, considering various options. Unfortunately, nothing came to mind. Suddenly, the man found a way out of the situation. Until then, he had been fixated on resolving the issue at Tengda and had forgotten about Shangyang's subsidiary. Pei Qian smiled happily and left the table, remembering that that branch was still steadily making a loss. He paced thoughtfully around the office until he had fully developed his plan. He needed to assign the girl a disastrous project to make her doubt her abilities. Pei Qian was pleased with himself. He would force Lin Wan to return home to her father, and he himself would continue spending millions. When the workday ended, Pei Qian called a limo to the office. He realized the delivery service wouldn't break the bank, so the man took his employees to a group dinner at a restaurant. Here, everyone could choose any dessert they liked. Many employees were seated at tables. A young man and woman stood to the side, enjoying glasses of fine wine. Lin Wang sat at a separate table and smiled when she received a new notification from a friend on her phone. Chen Sha begged her to help him with the project. He knew very well that the girl had some experience in game development. She turned away angrily and suggested finding another advisor. The young man begged Lin Wan to tell him how Ocean Fortress had achieved its success. She reminded him of how she'd given him benefits for leveling up his account, but Chen Sha had rejected the offer and ridiculed her. However, the beauty's anger softened and she promised to help. Lin Wan felt a little uneasy. She stood up from her table, wondering if her boss knew about her involvement in the rent reduction. As she approached the table where Pei Qian was sitting, the girl mentally justified herself by saying that a small reduction in rent would not affect the boss. She hoped Pei Qian didn't suspect anything. Lin Wan approached the boss's table and smiled warmly at him. The man immediately put on his friendly grimace, behind which nothing was visible, and cordially asked what was the matter. They both initially decided to play out their roles in front of each other until the end and pretend that they didn't suspect anything. Lin Wan arrived on time, just as Pei Qian had finished one of his plates. She asked if the boss remembered Chen Sha, who wanted to buy Barrett. Pei Qian asked in surprise. In fact, he was thinking wryly that he'd set the purchase limit at 500 units just in time. Lin Wan asked to remove the restriction at least for the main players. Not everyone has time to get the weapon. The man absent-mindedly agreed with her. He couldn't add more items to the pile for the resellers to profit from. Pei Qian raised his index finger and promised to change the inequality when the account reputation system was added. The girl heard about this system for the first time and, perplexed, asked her boss to tell her more about what it was. The man presented a gold cup and stated that the account number is assessed based on many factors. Key players like Chen Sha spend a lot of time in games and make a huge contribution to their development. Other players are ranked based on their credit rating. This prevents resellers from buying weapons due to low activity. Lin Wen immediately appreciated the method of weeding out unwanted customers and exclaimed admiringly that she would pass this on to the guy. When the girl left with a smile on her face, Pei Qian looked after her in bewilderment. He hadn't really come up with anything special. The man smiled and raised his glass of red wine. He was glad that so few people in the gaming industry understood the process. Peikin reached for the boiled crayfish, bragging that he had a huge advantage over the other developers. The man dug into the crunching claw. He estimated that after the expansion, no restaurant would be able to accommodate all the employees. Peikin was so upset by the lack of other restaurants in Jingzhou that he didn't even want to finish the seafood delicacy. Suddenly, a fresh idea struck him. The man smiled, deciding to open his own restaurant. He just needed to find quality ingredients. Peikin took a sip of the expensive red wine with relish. He was glad he always found a way to spend so much money. As he picked up his chopsticks, he heard cheers from behind. The employees were greeting Juan Sibo. Peikin turned around. The developers had surrounded their colleague, demanding that he drink 3 penalty drinks for being late. The man looked at director Zhu and Huang Sibo. He was pleased that the filming had finished on time. Peikin beckoned the boys over, smiling at them. Xiaocha only now noticed that the boss was there too. The young people sat down timidly at the table. The man smiled and told the staff they could eat whatever they wanted. Huang Sibo appreciated the great honor of dining with his boss, but he was at a loss as to why it happened today. He whispered to the director why Fei Huang's studio had become so active. Xiaocha whispered that their boss must have figured something out. The boys smiled at Pei Qian, whispering to each other that they had the best boss in the world. Peikin had been watching the staff closely the entire time, eating pieces of meat. He could tell from their facial expressions that the film idea had failed. The man casually asked how the documentary was going. Huang Sibo merely sighed heavily, bowing his head. The young man took out a phone with recorded fragments of the film and handed them over to his boss so that he could evaluate their abilities himself. Peikin, perplexed, picked up his phone and selected the first recording by number. The quality of the recording wasn't very good. Against the backdrop of colorful credits with the film's title, the hero playing the role of a cyber athlete explained the specifics of his profession in a voiceover. The man stared at the screen in bewilderment. Even the narrative itself was confusing and suitable only for school children. Peikin asked the waiter to bring more salads and delicacies to their table to feed the honored guests. He handed the phone to Juan Sibo with a smile, exclaiming that he really liked this brilliant story. The guy was pleased by the praise, but still felt awkward. Scratching his head, he admitted he wouldn't be able to recoup his expenses. Xiaozi closed his eyes and bowed his head. He added in a quiet voice that the film would only gross a few thousand. Peikin smiled faintly. This was excellent news. He immediately realized that TV series and documentaries generate different incomes. The friends sat dejectedly in silence, awaiting punishment. They knew they'd screwed up the film shoot. Peichen asked why they were so worried. Both men turned to their boss, perplexed. The man reacted as calmly to the loss of millions as if it were a matter of a few yuan. Peikin raised his glass and reminded his companions that they were filming a documentary, and so they had to be aware of the risk of losing money. Smiling, the man said that it was not a question of whether they could make money, but of what their contribution to the common cause would be. The young men smiled timidly and thanked their boss for his support. After Pei Tian's speech, they visibly brightened up. The young man finished his wine and exclaimed that they were on the right track since the film was attracting the attention of the players. He asked if he needed money for the next film. Without waiting for an answer, Pei Qian proudly said he would give any amount. Xiao Tu admitted with confusion that even their personal funds were not enough to pay the employees' salaries for the month. Pei Qian was delighted, his eyes gleaming. The man laughed and exclaimed that he would spare no expense in developing talent. The companions looked at the boss with bewilderment and unanimously said in confusion that they did not understand why he was happy. Peikin stated that they had done a great job. Despite the incredibly difficult situation, no one quit, which demonstrates the team's unity. He casually tossed a few $100 bills, saying that the boys could stop by his assistant any time to recoup their expenses. Pei Qian promised to pay the entire crew's salaries with interest. Huang Sibo, confused, said that was wrong. The man waved his hand, exclaiming that he would not allow anyone to negatively affect the company's reputation. Employees should feel comfortable. The partners gasped in surprise. This thought had never occurred to them before. It turned out the boss was willing to suffer losses for the sake of the company's image. The guys burst into tears of joy. They were pleased that the company always supported its employees, even in the face of failure. Peikin poured himself another glass of wine and slyly asked his friends if they would make another documentary. Xiaotuk spread his arms wide and said that they first needed to wait for their film to be published online. Everything depended on the reviews. He hesitated, suggesting that most people wouldn't be interested. He'd probably have to find a completely new plot. Tycoon was glad the film was a failure. He smiled at his partners and promised to lend them any amount of money for a new project. The man remembered that he had sent Shannel to Shanghai and asked Huang Sibo where the musician was now. The young man honestly replied that he had only decided to pay for his housing and food. Due to his busy schedule, they had no time to talk. Xiaocha nodded and added that he had planned to have Shanle sing a song in the film. But their budget was empty at that time. Tycoon asked where the singer was now. He was considering inviting the musician, but he was worried about the studio becoming too popular, so he sighed. Huang Sibo scratched his head thoughtfully and said he could call him. The man waved his hand, asking only out of curiosity. Tycoon asked to join him for dinner. They'd have time to talk about work later, and food should be eaten hot. The partners exchanged glances. They were very pleased that the boss was concerned not only about work, but also about his employees. He even remembered the singer. On the evening of June 21st, when the offices were already closed, a meeting was held on the first floor of the building in the Moyen Internet Cafe. Investor Li Shi lounged comfortably on a soft sofa in his snow-white suit, enjoying a cup of coffee. Mr. Liu, with whom he had arranged to meet, was 20 minutes late and apologized, citing urgent business at the company. The men exchanged greetings and handshakes. The investor invited his interlocutor to take the seat opposite him. Mr. Liu immediately reached into his inside jacket pocket, noting with displeasure that it was very difficult to find a good place. As soon as Li Shi noticed the tip of a cigar in his companion's hands, he immediately warned him that smoking was not allowed in this restaurant. Liu asked his interlocutor in surprise. Li Shi stood up and loomed over him, forcing him to put away his cigar. The man listened with displeasure and angrily suggested that the investor had changed his plans for investing capital. Li Shi calmly pointed out to Mr. Liu a row of gaming tables with computers and asked why they were placed in the cafe. The man didn't answer. Li Shi stirred his coffee and admitted he'd been watching the cafe owner for a while. After looking at his reflection in the cup, the investor declared that the guy lacked basic knowledge, which is why his business failed. Li Shi said that the only thing that saved the place was the singer. After his departure, the cafe lost its former popularity. Only now did Mr. Liu begin to understand what his interlocutor was getting at. He gestured toward the cafe, suggesting that Li Shi wanted to invest there. The investor nodded, sipping his coffee. He admitted he'd chosen this place primarily because of its prime location. The man said that Mr. Liu, as a real estate professional, could assess the prospects of a high-end internet cafe. He thoughtfully declared that in this place, even losses wouldn't matter. A cafe in such a location could significantly increase land prices in the entire area. Liu asked the investor if he had spoken with the cafe owner. Li Shi replied that he was waiting for the right moment. The man laughed and explained his plan. He'd simply wait until a few cafes started making huge losses. Mr. Liu grinned knowingly, clenching his fists. He stated that at this point, the investor buys real estate cheaply, acquiring management rights. Liu shook his head in protest. He believed there was no need to jump to conclusions and suggested simply observing. Rising from his seat, the man smiled at the investor and said that he expected to receive other offers soon. Li Shi looked at Mr. Liu in confusion. Until that moment, he had thought the plan was perfect. Pulling himself together, the investor smiled at his interlocutor and assured him that there was no need to worry. The cafe owner wouldn't be able to refuse them. On June 23rd, a large crowd gathered at Moyen Internet Cafe, despite its loss of popularity. Players at every table were glued to their monitors. Behind them, customers watched the screens with interest. A young man playing the role of a cyber athlete broadcast from all the displays about how he managed to become famous. Slapping his chest, the young man exclaimed that there was no need to doubt if you really wanted to achieve your dream. The players were so engrossed in the film that they didn't even notice the contradiction. After just a few minutes, the guy advised them to carefully consider everything and take their time. Attendees enthusiastically discussed the documentary and thoroughly enjoyed it. The players hadn't realized how difficult the life of an esports athlete can be. Two clients were discussing Fei Huang Studios' previous series. They thought it would be more interesting. Tycoon smiled after reading the forum comments. He immediately realized that not everyone liked the documentary. Moreover, the video really didn't break even and only earned a few thousand, despite being viewed 2 million times. The young man was proud of himself. He smiled to himself, folding his arms across his chest, and wished that nothing would happen this week. Tycoon held another meeting in his head. The 5 duplicates gathered around the wooden round table. The chairman opened the meeting with a blow of his wooden gavel. Seeing a raised hand, he announced that he was giving the floor to Tycoon. The bespectacled look-alike smiled. and explained that making documentaries had given them some experience. They realized it was difficult to make money from it. The young man thoughtfully shared his observations. The system prevents deliberately producing inferior products. He triumphantly exclaimed that he had found a solution. If the company maintained a high reputation, the system would not be able to block products. Another patron slowly sipped his coffee and remarked that in that case, the system wouldn't even notice the unprofitable cafe. The young man with the joystick sadly reminded that in the gaming industry, a high reputation means big sales. It's hard to lose money here. The chairman scratched his chin thoughtfully and said that the update for the latest game had not yet yielded any noticeable profit. Shangyang's company continues to delight him. Even after its merger with Tengda, it continues to suffer losses. Peikin took another sip of coffee and noted with a smile that the food delivery service and internet cafes also couldn't boast of making a profit. All 5 of Pei Qian's clones began a heated discussion, interrupting each other. They agreed that Lin Wan could pose a threat. Pei Qian sat in the cafe, writing down his notes. He scratched his head, trying to find a way to spend as much money as possible. The man sat with his back to the bar counter and therefore did not notice that the gentleman in the white suit was watching him intently. Investor Li Shi was pleasantly surprised to find that the internet cafe owner was the founder of Tengda. He didn't know Pei Qian personally, but from the manager's description he knew it was him and placed the cup of drink on the bar counter. Li Shi stared at the young man, recalling his biography. He believed Pei Qian had invested in the cafe only because he was very rich. The investor rose from his seat, smiling to himself. From the young man's notes, he realized he knew nothing about business. Li Shi left the internet cafe and busily dialed a number to quickly arrange a meeting with that guy. He casually clamped a cigarette between his teeth. While the call was ringing, the investor managed to light a cigarette. He asked his interlocutor to arrange a meeting with the cafe owner. Looking at the establishment's strange logo, Li Shi thought triumphantly that his extensive investment experience would allow him to quickly convince the guy. Pei Qian had indeed been poring over his income and expense records, as the investor had correctly noted. He couldn't have known the reason for the owner's sadness. In fact, the young man was trying to calculate how he could quickly incur a loss of a couple of $100,000 so as not to accidentally make money on it. Pei Qian was interrupted from his thoughts by a phone call. He glanced idly at the screen and saw that it was Hai Lu calling. He asked Shin's assistant what had happened. The brunette informed him that one of the investors wanted to invest in their company. Pei Qian winced. He had no use for extra income. He firmly declared that he must refuse the petitioner. The girl tried to explain that they weren't talking about company, but just about the cafe. The man stood his ground and demanded that they refuse the meeting. After ending the call, Pei Qian thought angrily that he would not allow anyone to invest in a cafe that was consistently losing money. The mere thought of it triggered an inordinate amount of aggression. The man clenched his teeth in anger. No one would stop him from taking losses. The investor was enjoying a smoke and standing next to a tall metal trash can. He heard the bell he'd been waiting for. Li Shi cheerfully asked the girl about the outcome of their conversation. Hai Lu stated that he had been denied a meeting. The investor couldn't believe that they were treating him like a schoolboy and even refused to meet him. In surprise, the man jumped to the side so quickly that the wind blew a green leaf off a tree growing nearby. Li Shi clenched his fists angrily, angered. He'd been rejected so quickly that he didn't even have time to finish his cigarette before he threw it on the pavement. The investor became so nervous that he smoked another cigarette at the door of the internet cafe to calm down a little. He couldn't understand why this guy had turned down the famous Fuhu Capital Company. The whole city knows about their activities. Li Shi tossed his half-smoked cigarette into the ashtray on the trash can and headed toward the cafe. He knew from personal experience that company bosses were usually happy to meet with investors. The man entered the cafe and glanced furtively at Pei Qian. He assumed the young man simply wanted to contact him later, once he'd expanded his business. The investor scratched his chin thoughtfully. He clearly saw the loss-making records. Additional financing was essential. Li Shi already saw himself as the owner of this place and was unwilling to back down. Fortunately, the decision came to him quite quickly. The investor could have made this guy rich. But now Pei Qian was just sitting at a table in an empty cafe. Li Shi thought angrily that the guy wanted to control everything personally. He chuckled softly, wagging 2 fingers in disapproval. The man knew a proper businessman wouldn't do that. The investor climbed onto a stool at the bar so that he could watch the young man and smugly declared that no one had ever refused him. Li Shi's cup reflected his malicious grin. He thought Pei Qian was the type who wouldn't ask for help. The next day, Zhang Wan came to work at the cafe. He knew his colleagues were busy with exams and he would have to work alone. While he was talking to a customer at the bar, he suddenly saw Ma Yan walking towards them out of the corner of his eye. The man immediately turned to the general manager and raised his hand in a friendly manner, asking how the exams had gone. Ma Yan sat down on the chair next to him and smiled, explaining that he was taking a non-core subject today and didn't even need to prepare. The young man yawned so sweetly that tears welled up in his eyes. He assumed that after the exams, Pei Qian wouldn't be so worried about the losses. Cheng Yuan exclaimed that he liked the idea. He decided to follow Ma Yan's example. Everything in life should be easy. A waiter came up to them and brought Ma Yan the yellow cocktail with ice and lemon that he had just ordered. The young man absent-mindedly took his drink and admitted that he'd already mentally said goodbye to the cafe. Fortunately, all was not lost. Cheng Yuan sighed heavily and shared his observations. Their boss hadn't looked up from his notes for the past 2 days. Ma Yan bowed his head sadly. Zhang Yuan's expression darkened as well. He saw that his boss wasn't promoting the cafe, even though he could have done so. The interviewee sadly said that even the app sells the most ordinary dishes at astronomical prices. The companions sighed wearily, bowing their heads. They both understood perfectly well that the cafe would soon have to close altogether. Ma Yan turned his head toward the dining room. Only now did he realize there was no one in the cafe, and he asked, puzzled, what was going on. Cheng Yuan realized with surprise that the young man was right. No one was sitting at the computers, and the soft sofas were deserted. Cheng Yuan looked around in confusion, trying to figure out what had happened. He assumed it was just a coincidence. A breathless courier ran up to the managers. He greeted them hastily and exclaimed that something terrible had happened. The man held 3 different flyers inviting people to the opening of a cafe and asked them to take a closer look. Ma Yan took the flyers and asked, puzzled, what this had to do with their cafe. Zhang Yuan didn't understand either. The courier bowed his head and explained that, by a strange coincidence, the cafe was located next to their establishment, Moyun. The administrators exchanged quick glances. There was no doubt that this was the work of competitors. Ma Yan scratched his ear in confusion. As far as he knew, there was no one to oppose them. Zhang Yuan believed they were simply trying to drive them out. He recalled that recently many different bars and cafes have begun to open, and someone is clearly behind this. The courier added, puzzled, that several intersections near the cafe were completely filled with leaflets, lying everywhere on the ground. Zhang Yuan overheard 2 waiters quietly discussing the possibility of lowering the prices a little in their establishment. Turning to them, the manager exclaimed that this could not be done, because in this case, the establishment would lose its reputation. Ma Yan lazily glanced through the leaflets and turned to Zhang Yuan, asking how he planned to save the internet cafe. He confidently declared that Boss Pei himself should handle this matter. Ma Yan sighed wearily. He knew the boss had been very busy lately. However, he knew it was a sound decision and called Pei Tian, who was in the Tengda Company office at the time. The man greeted his friend with a puzzled expression. His friend began to explain, haltingly and aggressively, the problem the cafe's management was facing. Pei Tian was overjoyed and clenched the fist of his free hand. Finally, the heavens heard him and sent him a gift in the form of losses. Ma Yan asked his boss, frightened, what to do now? The man pressed his fingers to his mouth to hide his laughter. This was the best news in a long time. By the evening, the internet cafe had finally acquired a few regular customers who liked the atmosphere. They were partly able to retain their popularity thanks to the new singer. He couldn't compare to Chen Lei, but he created the appearance of a cozy cafe. Ma Yan sighed heavily. The conversation with the boss hadn't cleared anything up, and Pei Qian had demanded that everything be left as is. Suddenly, the young man noticed a richly dressed gentleman standing next to him, an expensive cocktail in hand. He was a little surprised. Such people usually relaxed in restaurants. Lisha bowed to the general manager and introduced himself. The investor immediately reached into his inside pocket for his business card. The man handed over his card and stated that he was a regular customer of the establishment and would like to discuss cooperation. Ma Yan read the company name with bewilderment. Lisha gritted his teeth in anger when he realized this guy hadn't heard of Fuhu Capital either. Lisha was confident that he would succeed this time and politely asked Ma Yan if they could talk. The manager sat there looking sad, so he didn't refuse the company. They lightly clinked glasses to introduce themselves. The investor briefly outlined his proposal and took another sip. He asked the manager's opinion. Ma Yan smiled politely and admitted that the proposal was very good, but he couldn't make a decision without the boss. Lisha nodded understandingly, trying to hide his displeasure. This guy seemed like a simpleton, but he turned out to be a cunning fox. A young man and woman sat in the cafe until closing time. The waiter bowed to them and wished them a visit if they had the chance. Ma Yan decided to call his friend again and convince him. He told his boss that the investment could yield significant profits. Pei Qian imagined this conversation as a dispute between two friends who were speaking at the podium opposite each other in a high temple. The man shook his head and chided his interlocutor. He'd simply been deceived. In fact, he was pleased with Ma Yan's trust. The manager moved closer to the podium in surprise, almost climbing onto it. He indignantly asked what this meant. Pei Qian smiled and said that this investor had already tried to meet with him through Shin's assistant, but was refused. The entire space in front of Ma Yan turned into a cloud of question marks. He exclaimed in surprise, thinking this was a great chance to improve their situation. Pei Qian angrily slapped his palms on the podium. No one in their time does charity work for the benefit of others. He angrily reminded them, angrily poking the invisible enemy, that all the local shops and cafes had openly united against them, and that someone was behind it. Ma Yan's face darkened. He was beginning to realize that his boss was hinting at a connection between the investor and the stores. The young man angrily slammed both fists on the lectern, shouting that he had been deceived all this time. He would never forgive Li Shi for this. Pei Qian smiled and waved two fingers, stopping his friend from making any categorical decisions. He said that it was impossible to refuse outright. The man suggested that his friend tell the investor that he was a little concerned and not ready to accept the investment, but that things could still change in the future. Ma Yan scratched his head in confusion and said that they would continue to lose money if they didn't accept outside help. Pei Qian smiled and lied to his friend that things weren't so bad. Once they started losing more money, they'd be flooded with customers. Ma Yan joyfully exclaimed that he understood everything and would convey the exact words to the investor. The young man breathed a sigh of relief. The boss had resolved the issue of losses. When the guy disappeared, Pei Qian looked at the empty lectern with a frown, thinking that the investor had managed to easily fool his friend. If it had been anyone else, he would have accepted Li Shi's offer. But Pei Qian merely laughed maliciously, rejoicing at his losses. Ma Yan returned to the cafe, where the man awaited his answer. The young man was glad that the wise Pei Qian had told him how to deal with the deceiver. He honestly told his boss about his call to get his opinion. The investor frowned at the manager, guessing what the answer would be. Ma Yan sighed and said that Pei Qian was a little concerned about the situation, but he would try to handle it himself. If the situation didn't stabilize within a month, he would look for other options. Li Shi clenched his fists in irritation. This guy wasn't going to give in, even though he had to suffer losses for a month. Pulling himself together, the investor smiled politely and assured the manager he was in no rush. Boss Pei would make the necessary decision himself. In a sign of cooperation, Ma Yan raised his hand and loudly asked the waiter to bring another margarita for Mr. Li. For several days, Pei Qian was absent from the Tengda company office and transmitted all his instructions through his assistant Shin. Baoshi noticed this and asked Ming Liang what was wrong. The chief planner replied thoughtfully that he was busy with business at the cafe. Min Liang pulled out a report on the Ocean Fortress update and suggested starting work on the final DLC. Bao sighed, spread his arms out to the sides, and said that compared to Moyu Cafe, this could last for a few days. He smiled, remembering that the number of active players making purchases had increased greatly recently. Min Liang raised his head and smiled back at the employee. He was willing to delay the report if it wouldn't harm the overall effort. Another 2 days passed. Pei Qian decided the situation at the internet cafe had stabilized and spent his time in the office. Every now and then, the man would take a break from work and check messages on gaming forums. Unfortunately, the news wasn't encouraging. He leaned back in his chair wearily, closing his eyes. Lately, even his emails had been sending him nothing but bad news. He recalled the 4 employees who formed the company's core. If any of them encountered problems, no one told the boss about it. Of course, Pei Qian was already aware of everything that was going on. It was very difficult for him to pretend he didn't notice anything around him. The only good thing was that the games didn't bring in much income, except for the fact that Ocean Fortress became very popular. The man was very angry that the profits from the Ocean Fortress continued to grow, but no one reported this to him. Pei Qian decided to visit the gaming forum again. He couldn't understand why everyone around him was silent, as if they were waiting for something. Unfortunately, things weren't much better on the website. The documentary bombed at the box office, but boosted sales of the game. Pei Qian told himself it was just a coincidence. He sighed wearily and slammed the lid of his laptop shut. The man rose from his desk, thinking that the profit was still within acceptable limits. Pei Qian pressed the doorknob and left the office. He closed the door absent-mindedly, still thinking about how to quickly slow down the game's rapid growth in sales. Pei-Ken walked down the corridor, lost in thought. Various thoughts crossed his mind, but none of them were perfect. As he walked past the employees in the office, the chief planner saw the boss and turned his head in surprise. Min Liang and Bao Shu began whispering about whether they should report to the boss. Bao Shu suggested holding off on the report. The man decided to do things his own way and tugged at his boss's sleeve, catching up with him. Pei Qian turned to the chief planner in bewilderment. Scratching the back of his head, Ming Liang quietly admitted that he had something he wanted to announce. The number of active players in Ocean Fortress had increased significantly. Pei Qian laughed loudly and told his interlocutor that he had known about this for a long time from other sources. Ming Liang closed his eyes in shame. He reproached himself for not telling him about it sooner. His boss had already found out the information anyway. Pretending to smile, the chief planner turned around and walked away with clenched fists under Pei Qian's watchful gaze. The man watched Ming Liang with glee. He was convinced that he had made the right choice in appointing the boy to this position. The young men passed each other. Pei Qian thought he had underestimated the mastermind. He was much more cunning than he appeared. On Sunday, Pei Qian spent the whole day at Moyen Cafe and found that his profit had not improved in a few days. In the evening, Lisha came to the establishment again and watched the owner, looking at him intently through his glasses lowered on his nose. The young man felt himself being closely examined and looked up from his phone in bewilderment. The investor grinned. Pei Qian turned around. Recognizing Lisha, the young man angrily thought that the guy still wouldn't calm down and turned back. He enthusiastically played a mobile game, commenting on his winning combinations. The investor's actions were helping his business go bankrupt. Lisha heard Pei Qian's worried cry and interpreted it as the young man still being worried about his business. Now that Pei Qian was beginning to hesitate, the investor felt like a winner and drained his glass with a sense of accomplishment. But at the same time, the man felt a little uneasy. He looked around the room in bewilderment, holding a new glass in his hand, experiencing a strange feeling. Lisha looked thoughtfully at his competitor through the yellow drink. He had no doubt in the boy's abilities, since he had achieved success at such a young age. The only strange thing was that Pei Qian didn't even try to save the reputation of his cafe and instead played on his phone. The investor smiled smugly and silently replied that the guy had calculated everything. If he lowered prices, things would only get worse. Lisha suspected Pei Qian had an ace up his sleeve. Suddenly, the young man let out a cry of disappointment. The investor kept a close eye on the establishment's owner. He hoped the young man had received bad news and would make concessions. Pei Qian cried out in displeasure that he'd lost again. Lisha chuckled softly. He realized he'd overestimated his competitor. He had no time for business now. At that moment, the young man received a call from Huang Xibo. The call menu overlaid the game interface, angering Pei Qian. The man greeted his interlocutor and asked why Huang Xibo was calling at such a late hour. Lisha was about to leave when he turned around with interest, overhearing a conversation on the phone. He assumed something was wrong. Huang Xibo haltingly asked to turn on the satellite TV quickly and congratulated him on his victory. Pei Qian's eyes nearly popped out of his head in surprise. He ran out from behind the table and waved his hand, loudly demanding that Zhang Yuan quickly turn on the projector and satellite TV. The bartender smiled and nodded. The young man, pleased to see his boss as energetic as ever, turned on the TV with the remote. The image was still loading. Pei Qian frantically searched through his options, unable to understand why Huang Xibo was congratulating him. An image of a full concert hall appeared on the screen, and the same singer Chen Lei was performing on stage. 4 sponsors attended the performance. The soulful singing captivated them all from the first note, and all 4 pressed the buttons in their stands. Each of the men understood that this guy could be compared to a diamond and wanted to get him into their company. Recognizing Chen Lei, Pei Qian paled. The man began to understand what was going on. His lips curled into the grin of a man facing the inevitable. The man experienced the same feeling he had once had. The sturdy monolith that had embodied his empire began to crack at the seams. Chen Lei had become so famous that he was now featured on Shanghai television as a celebrity. Pei Qian remembered with bewilderment that this program would only air in 2 years. The guy wasn't supposed to get on television. The man remembered the tragedy on Alice Island and grabbed his head in horror. He did not want to start his business again. Lisha stared at the screen with interest, unable to understand anything. Zhang Yuan immediately recognized his friend and was happy for him. The investor knew that Chen Lei was simply maintaining good relations with the city's residents. He had no need to worry about that. Suddenly, the investor realized that he was mistaken. An ordinary musician represented a serious threat to him. Shannel was now speaking to millions of viewers watching on television. He smiled and introduced himself. Having finished playing the sad composition, the young man put the guitar behind his back and bowed to the four mentors. The show's manager stepped up to the microphone and announced that only a person with a difficult biography could have written such talented lyrics. He suggested that Shannel had written the song for his girlfriend. The young man took the microphone and replied with a smile that he had written the composition for a specific location. He smiled sheepishly, admitting to an audience of millions that it was an ordinary internet cafe with a homey feel. The singer said he had been struggling to find work for a long time due to low self-esteem. A simple encounter at this cafe changed his entire life. Lishi frowned. Everything was so smooth that the investor began to suspect Pei Qian and the singer of collusion, and that it was being broadcast specifically for him. Shannel shared how he was able to realize his dream in Shanghai thanks to a cafe owner. Unfortunately, after he left, the establishment's profits declined significantly. Barely holding back tears, the young man said that Pei Qian never asked him to come back because he didn't want to bother him. The musician said that he had the opportunity to perform on stage today in front of many spectators. Shanle's eyes began to water again with happiness. He sheepishly admitted that he wanted to thank Pei Qian for his kindness. The young man smiled at the audience and loudly announced that he considered the internet cafe that had given him a chance at a new future his second home. All the spectators loudly applauded the singer and shouted his name. Each of the mentors offered him their own conditions. One of the sponsors took the microphone and told Shannel with a smile that each of the mentors would be glad to see him in their company. The musician smiled warmly and replied that he would first like to return to the internet cafe and tell his fans that he misses them. Pei Qian angrily demanded that the projector be turned off. That was enough. Zhang Yuan clicked the remote control. The image on the white screen disappeared. Lishi took this as a jab. He believed Pei Qian's gesture was a sign that he had won and there was no need to continue watching the show. The investor bowed his head dejectedly. He knew that the story of Shannel and the internet cafe would soon spread across the internet. Overcoming his composure, the man rose from his table and walked toward Pei Qian. He realized he had lost the battle for fame. Lishi told the young man that he greatly admired him and was pleased to see Pei Qian fighting for the cafe. The man didn't know that the cafe owner was actually very alarmed by the famous singer's statement. Lishi didn't notice this and smiled at the young man, admitting that he had actually underestimated his opponent's business acumen. He waved goodbye, leaving open the possibility of further collaboration in the future. The sullen Pei Qian didn't even flinch. Only when the investor left the internet cafe did the man realize he'd spoken to him. He was surprised to see Lishi had already left. Pei Qian belatedly called out to the investor, as if he could hear him, and exclaimed that there was a misunderstanding. The man noticed how happy the waiters were. They were crying with joy, hugging each other. Now he didn't have to worry about the cafe. Pei Qian bowed his head. He knew the cafe would become popular again. The worst part was that Shannel would be coming to perform. The man gritted his teeth. There were still 3 whole days left until the results were announced. By that time, the singer would simply make him rich. Ma Yan went outside for some fresh air. He was so overjoyed by the cafe's success that he didn't notice his boss's expression. Pei Qian was as black as a thundercloud. The manager joyfully ran up to his talented friend to congratulate him on his success. People had already begun to arrive. Ma Yan happily shook hands with his boss and declared that he now understood why Shannel had been sent so far away. Weeping with joy, the boy suggested that Pei Qian had foreseen the singer's success. The man angrily replied that he hadn't even thought about it. Ma Yan wiped away his tears with his fist and asked permission to begin the formal presentation that evening. He suggested hiring more waiters. Pei Qian tried to put a smile on his face and asked them not to do anything. They should rest. Ma Yan reminded him that his boss had always wanted to make the cafe popular. Slapping his chest, the young man exclaimed that everything would work out now. He left, declaring at the end that he would do everything as expected. Ma Yan didn't notice Pei Qian's sad gaze as he left. The man felt as if he were kneeling in a spotlight. He thanked the manager in a trembling voice. Meanwhile, more and more customers were arriving at the cafe. They were animatedly discussing this wonderful place. Pei Qian wearily clutched his head as he saw the endless crowd of the singer's fans. Nearby cafes had ceased operations in the anticipation of his arrival. The man shivered, feeling like he was freezing from the midsummer snowfall. This was due to the realization that the source of his losses had disappeared. The next day, Pei Qian lay lazily on the sofa, eating a cake. He thought with displeasure that yesterday's profits must have been very high. The man had bags under his eyes due to lack of sleep and stress. His only relief was that his system account was negative. Tycoon understood that the cafe would generate increased profits. He hoped the game wouldn't be so successful and wouldn't reach the 2 million mark. The man reached for a carton of milk on the table. He estimated that the cafe had made no more than 100,000 rubles yesterday. The young man frowned as he remembered Shannel. Because of this guy, the cafe's profits could skyrocket. That much was immediately clear. Fortunately, Tycoon had a stable expense account. Employee salaries cost up to 300,000 rubles quarterly. The young man choked on his milk when he saw the system notification. To his surprise, the bill had grown by more than 1 million overnight. Tycoon angrily exclaimed that there were serious problems now and stared at his laptop, trying to find a source of income. He quickly ran through the sales reports for his games. Everything was within the norm, except for Ocean Fortress, which brought in 1 million more than expected. The situation had become so dire that another meeting had to be held in Tycoon's head. Everyone in the room sat there, clutching their heads. The chairman banged his gavel and pointed out that the game's popularity had grown after the documentary's release. However, that still doesn't explain the game's high sales. The neighbor on the right reasonably noted that the company had not yet sold out those 500 copies of weapons for the game. Tycoon, wearing a white t-shirt, sighed heavily, resting his cheeks on his fists. He thoughtfully asked the others what they might have done wrong. After checking the report, the man with the cup said that the whole thing was due to the increased number of active players who were replenishing their gaming accounts. A heated discussion ensued. The meeting participants couldn't understand how this could have happened. In fact, the update was completely useless. Tycoon, wearing a red bow tie, raised his hand to demand the floor and asked the others to look at his laptop screen. All 5 read with interest the revelations of one of the players who was offered to play Ocean Fortress. Things turned out to be even worse. Instead of in-game purchases, resellers were now selling accounts and fueling interest in the game. The chairman angrily slammed his gavel on the table, declaring that they were trapped in a vicious circle. The money simply couldn't be lost. Having finished his milk, Tycoon wearily pressed the back of his hand to his forehead. He himself was to blame for the success of the Ocean Fortress. The man forced himself to get up from the couch and walked unsteadily out of the room. He decided to go to a cafe as he'd already lost this round anyway. By evening, a lot of people had gathered near the internet cafe. Fans were happy even just to be able to hear the singer. Those lucky enough to get a spot like the girl in the red dress followed her example and filmed the concert on their phone's video camera. The hall was packed with spectators, and the waiters could barely keep up with the alcoholic drinks. It was just like the days of sales success. A guy and a girl who accidentally walked into a cafe were surprised by how pleasant the atmosphere was. Now even gamers have taken notice of gaming computers. To the surprise of one gamer, they were equipped with top-of-the-line configurations. Many visitors saw only advantages in this cafe. The prices no longer seemed exorbitant, given the excellent service. The most beautiful visitors vied with each other to shout out Shanley's name and confess their love to him. Some even came with banners. The musician was pleased that the audience hadn't forgotten him. He gave it his all, performing the crowd's favorite songs. Customers discussed how things would change after the singer's departure. One woman excitedly said they'd have to reserve tables in advance. Tycoon was close to tears. The excellent, unprofitable cafe had left him disappointed. He knew the worst was yet to come. He sadly recalled how good things had been before. He had the huge cafe entirely to himself. Tycoon roared, his shoulders shaking. When the out-of-breath manager ran up to him, the man had already calmed down and looked up. Ma Yan boasted that he'd reserved a table for the boss. He cheerfully exclaimed that Tycoon had thought of everything in advance and had opened several establishments. With these words, he killed the man outright. The manager scratched his head and admitted he had to leave on business. Tycoon clapped his hands. He was willing to let the boy go. When Ma Yan left, the man sighed with relief. He bowed his head and ignored the gentleman in the gray suit at the next table, who was telling the waiter something. The young man shouted loudly across the room that he had great news. Mr. Lin was paying for all the drinks today. Tycoon turned around in surprise. He was sitting in his office in a skyscraper on the day of the results announcement. Drink felt thirsty. He took out a can of soda and opened it. He took a sip of soda and couldn't figure out what had gone wrong. He thought that critical moments were starting to happen more and more often. Pei sat in his chair. He thought to himself with displeasure that he needed to do something to avoid becoming poor. He realized that he needed to rely on a small percentage of profits to make money. The owner demanded a system. The system showed him detailed calculations regarding the transformation of wealth. He said in a dissatisfied voice that in 2 months of hard work, he had earned more than 20,000. The guy put the can of drink on the table. He decided to take a break for himself. Pei thought that several games were still making money. The monthly turnover of a game called Ocean Fortress had exceeded 10 million. Internet cafes were also starting to bring in a fair amount of money. The guy thought that if he did nothing, he could earn 5 or 6 million a month. He put on a cape and went to the window. He calculated that he could save 5 million yuan every month. In the end, he would convert 100,000 yuan. The system gave the owner a reward for completing a special task. The guy was very surprised. He abruptly took off his cape and threw it in front of him. He was unhappy because he had a profit. He wanted to lose. Pei thought to himself that a gift within the system makes him worry. He paced the office. He decided that with the help of props, he could radically change the wealth coefficient. The guy sat down on the couch. He thought that the current cycle lasted 4 months. That would be enough to show his strength and accomplish some things. Suddenly, the main character's phone rang in his pocket. He reached out to pick it up. Pei happily greeted his friend named Ma Yan on the phone. Ma Yan happily announced that Mr. Lin wanted to meet the protagonist. Pei asked his interlocutor in surprise what Lin Chang wanted from him. He was driving to a meeting in a car. A girl was driving. He thought that even with a high profit, he wouldn't be able to get all the money. The system told him that he had made a considerable amount when he was an actor. Pei asked the system how his salary would be calculated once he became an actor at the Fei Huan studio. The system told the owner that he would receive 1,500 rubles daily. He thought to himself that if he didn't arouse the system's suspicions, then everything should go smoothly. The passenger looked at his driver. He decided that there were certain risks. He arrived at the second branch of the internet cafe. There was a guy sitting at the table. The guy was holding a cup of coffee in his hands. He greeted Pei's boss with a smile. Lin shook the protagonist's hand. He said his sister was grateful for his concern. Pei replied that he had spent hundreds of thousands and that this could not be considered gratitude. The interlocutor was confused. He thought about the protagonist's words. Lin very abruptly pulled his hand away from the protagonist's. Pei found himself confused. The interlocutor smiled at the main character and said that all of this was absolutely true. Lin stirred the drink in his cup. He said that his youngest sister had been the most caring of them since childhood. Even their father couldn't influence her. The interlocutor looked at the main character and said that the girl was behaving very peacefully and down to earth with him. He was dissatisfied when he heard his interlocutor's words. Pei told the guy that his father was against the girl working for them. The guy told the main character that the girl's favorite job is as a designer. Lin said thoughtfully that he understood his sister's choice. He himself, in his youth, dreamed of becoming the lead singer of a band. He smiled and told his interlocutor that his family members were multifaceted. Lin replied that this was all true. Lin looked at his interlocutor and said that he wanted to ask him to take care of his sister. He also apologized for the inconvenience. He silently raised his hand. He showed his interlocutor not to worry. Lin smiled and suggested that Boss Pei discuss further details. He was talking with the guest. He was surprised when he heard about the 500 fire Kirans. Pei calculated that the share would be 37%, meaning the maximum profit would be 200,000 yuan. He took the cup in his hands and told his interlocutor that there was no need for it. The guy tapped his finger on the table and told his interlocutor that he had a different opinion on the matter. Pei told his interlocutor that he now wants to invest money in a certain business. He would agree if Lazy reimbursed him for the expenses. The guy looked happily at the main character and asked how much he needed. Pei gestured to his interlocutor and said that he needed 200,000. The guy explained that 100,000 would go towards salaries. The other 100 would go towards props. He decided to create several short series of 20 episodes each. Lin said with excitement that the director's salary would only be 5,000 yuan per episode. He proposed doubling the salary. Lin thought to himself that the boss needs money for entertainment. The guest looked at the main character and thought that all this would bring them closer together. He held a cup of drink. He thought the system hadn't warned him. Pei thought he'd easily earn 200,000. He'd previously worked hard to convert that kind of money. He was at home in a room in a tall building. On the 1st of July, the guy was sitting alone on the couch and looking at his phone. He was surprised to see that Lin Chang very quickly transferred 300,000 to his account. The guy glanced at his phone. He thought that he would definitely spend 100,000 on props to shoot a couple of videos. He was surprised to realize that it was Teacher Zhang who called him on the phone. Pei picked up the phone and greeted Teacher Zhang with a joyful voice. He realistically imagined himself standing in front of Teacher Zhang in the room and talking to him. Chang was a consultant at Handong University. He glanced at the protagonist and told him that he had made a short film and joined the studio. He replied to his interlocutor that everything was exactly like that. He asked, how could he help him? The teacher told the boy joyfully that he always knew that he was very talented. Pei looked at the man and thought that he was really lying. The teacher glanced at the protagonist and said that some students still hadn't found jobs. He asked the protagonist to share their problems with the studio's management. Pei glanced at the teacher and decided he had come to the wrong place. He suggested that he go to campus and try to get a job there. Chang turned around and thoughtfully told the guy that there was nothing suitable on campus. Otherwise, he wouldn't have approached him. He thought for a moment. Suddenly, an original idea came to him. Pei happily realized to himself that by students, Zhang meant his disciples. He anxiously told teacher Zhang not to worry and to rely on him. The boy asked the teacher to send him the lists. The teacher told the main character with a smile that he would send him his resume by email. He was sitting near the laptop. He was carefully reading the messages. Pei was very happy. He received the necessary information from the teacher. He slammed the laptop lid shut, wondering what to do next. Pei thought that the 20-odd people didn't stand out in any way. He decided it was time to accept the newcomers. He walked in circles around the room. He didn't know what he could assign to the new workers. Pei realized he couldn't hire new people for the gaming department. He eventually decided to hire students to work at the internet cafe. Suddenly, the guy came up with an original idea. He decided to create a company for the new workers. Pei decided to choose a lucky person from Tengda and open a new company with an administrator and other staff. After that, the company will begin to rapidly lose money. He threw on his jacket. He thought that there was still an unresolved danger in the company. It needed to be dealt with. Pei straightened his tie and prepared to leave. He still had a lot to do. He decided to talk to Ma and Kun about the plot. Pei remembered that the guy had embellished the content of the games. This attracted a new wave of players. He walked up to the door and opened it. He decided that this time he would succeed. Pei thought to himself happily that he would create a website with online books. A guy in the office asked his colleagues if their boss could announce the development of a new game at a meeting. The girl at the computer told her colleagues that they hadn't had a meeting for a long time. He approached the door and grabbed the handle. He opened it and prepared to go inside the room. He looked at his employees and said that they were all here. The employees looked at him silently. He walked over to the chair and pulled it back. He thought to himself that it was only right for him to gather the entire gaming department. He already had some ideas about the new game. He decided that he couldn't repeat the mistakes of the past. Pei looked at the computer. He thought that given the specifics of the system, he needed to be very careful. The price per game could fluctuate within a certain range. It should correspond to the investment. The workers looked at the boss in surprise. He thought that he himself was very limited, and that losing money was not so easy for him. Pei smiled, and thought that even without having money, you can earn it. He thought for a moment and coughed. He prepared to speak. The boss told his subordinates that he had several demands regarding the new game. Pei thought to himself that he would need to create a new gaming niche. The worker joyfully shouted that they would have a new game. He thought more investment would be required. Even if people heard about the game, that didn't mean they'd rush to buy it. Pei raised his thumbs up and voiced his first requirement for the game. He told his subordinates that the game should have a Chinese theme. They needed to create as many different puzzles as possible. Most of them needed to be written in ancient script. A bespectacled employee carefully wrote everything down. He thought slyly to himself that the Europeans would not play a complex game. The boss ordered his subordinates to make the game very difficult, and the riddles must be impassable. Pei demanded that the workers add a lot of features, actions, and scenes to the game. The majority of the budget should go here. He demanded that the game have a very long refund period. The employee carefully wrote everything down. Pei slyly told his subordinates that the game should be called Salvation Comes to Him Who Repents. The workers were very surprised when they heard information from the boss about the new game. The workers looked at each other in surprise. They were all confused. The worker told the boss to tell him more about the game's difficulty. The boss was delighted. He decided to explain the game's difficulty to his subordinate in detail. The system informed the owner that if too many players could not complete the game, it would be considered a violation. He got angry. He realized that the difficulty of the game would depend entirely on him. Pei reassured himself. He decided that a small problem could not stop him. He decided to create a special weapon in the game. It will only be obtainable if the player follows an absurd route. The boss told his subordinates that most gamers would be able to complete the game, but some skill would be required. Pei demanded that the workers make the game very difficult. He would then add a few changes. He decided that he would set the game to extreme difficulty. In the end, only he would be able to complete it. One of the employees told the boss that specific material would be embedded into the game. He yawned in a tired voice and said that the meeting needed to end. The boss waved his hand and told the subordinates named Ma and Quan to stay. Quan thought happily that the boss wanted to tell him more about the plot. The worker approached and prepared to sit next to the protagonist. He was glad that he would be able to communicate with his boss in person. Quan looked questioningly at the boss. He was waiting for his superior to tell him about the display in the game. He informed the employee with a smile that he would no longer work at Tengda Games. Quan was very scared. He decided that his boss was getting ready to fire him. The guy abruptly squatted down. He thought to himself in fear that he hadn't done a good job. The employee recalled that his colleagues spoke well of him. He thought he might have been fired because of the previous incident. He told his subordinate that he should open a website with books. Quan would be able to prove himself in this way. The guy calmed down. He realized that this was not a dismissal, but another appointment. The guy was delighted. He asked excitedly what the current status of the project was. He explained that he would be assembling the financial and management staff very soon. Quan would have to work on the website every day. He pointed his finger at the ceiling. He told his subordinate that his workplace would be upstairs. He hired newcomers from the university as staff. Pei looked at the satisfied worker. He thought that the Fei Huang studio was developing in the direction of industry and television, and the cafe was already entering a different market. He looked at the guy with satisfaction and thought that this would be an important step on the way to his individuality. He looked at the guy. He decided that so far he was creating good projects. Eventually, the Fei Huan studio would be shown on television. Pei thought that thanks to the project, Tenga Games would also be able to create their own games. In the future, this promising plan would bear fruit. The guy told his boss in fear that he might not be able to handle such a job. Hong explained in a frightened voice that he could lead people down the wrong path. He would have great responsibility. He thought angrily that this was precisely why he had appointed the guy to the job. Pei thought to himself that he definitely didn't need the book to shoot up the charts. He glanced at the screen and noticed that the websites were boiling. He thought happily to himself that his employee would be excellent insurance. Pei thought they already had a website called Unlimited Literature. This website had grown into a large-scale operation. The boss decided that Ma Yi Kwan's skills would work against the website. He decided that training students would take a long time, making the project unreliable. Pei thought that manuscripts would be constantly checked and delayed. Readers would not be able to find a good book to read. As a result, a vicious circle would form. The boss put his hand on the guy's shoulder and said that everyone envied his talent. The subordinate asked the boss, "Has he really read his book?" He happily told the guy that his talent was immediately visible. Quan promised his boss that he would do his best to make a good website. The guy excitedly asked his boss what to call the new website. He told the worker that the site should be called the Chinese Network's Endpoint. He thought to himself that the site would be a failure from the very beginning. Zhang was happy. He told the boss that he understood him. He got ready to go to work. At parting, the boss told his subordinate to contact him with all questions. The office was bustling with activity. Employees were walking around the room and chatting with each other. He thought to himself that the work in Tengda is finished. Now it's time for Shangyang. Pei was sitting at the computer. He noticed that in one game, old players had returned, but the donations still weren't particularly high. He was sitting at the computer and decided to analyze the game plan. He thought he might get a warning from the system. Pei sat in the large hall and read the documents. He said the game was a strategy game, with only a few simple hints included in the gameplay. Pei tossed the documents aside. He said the settings were missing a lot and he wouldn't make any changes. If he decided to provide everything for the Yeji Zhou group, everything would be lost. The guy looked at the documents with interest and said that the 13th autonomous project was a good idea. He read it and said that Wang Xiaobin is a specialist in numerical planning. Pei thought to himself that the project design is very conservative. If everything is done according to plan, he won't lose much money. He looked carefully at the papers. He decided that if he couldn't find anything better, he would take Wang Xiaobin's project. He was surprised to see a document called The Song of the Bloody Battle. Its author was Yeji Zhou. The guy was delighted and pressed the red button with all his strength. He said that this was all very good. Pei was sitting at the computer. He said that no changes to the gameplay were needed. He added a few details and the plot moved forward a little. He started making adjustments to the game. He told himself happily that he would figure it out. He wrote a message to his subordinates about how to fix the game. Pei said happily that he now knows how to advance the game with losses. He will spend a lot of money and get a lot of losses. During the day, workers were sitting in a large office building. They were busy playing a game. One of the programmers turned around and shouted for Van to come over and take a look. Zhang approached a colleague and asked what was going on. The employee explained that the boss had sent them a plan for a new game. He had chosen his idea. Van asked his friend if the boss had changed the design. The guy replied that the boss had only changed the name. Van was very excited. He asked what name the boss had chosen. The programmer said that the boss chose the name Blood Moon Song Enhanced Version. Van was very surprised at the name Boss Pei chose. A surprised Van stood near the table. He didn't expect that the boss had changed the name of the Jijo plan. The guy was unhappy. He remembered that he once played games peacefully, and now he found himself here. He decided to create his own game. Van thought he was an unusual talent who wanted to save the gaming industry. The programmer glanced at the computer. He didn't understand why the Jijo plan was ultimately chosen. She glanced at the monitor and told his friend that he thought his plan was also not bad. Wang was very surprised. She told him that the boss considered him very conservative. The guy was delighted. He realized that the boss approved of his plan, but his approach turned out to be conservative. The game wasn't suitable as a standalone game for now. Van happily told his friend that he could take a few of the usual ideas, but they were already outdated. The programmer said thoughtfully that the boss had immediately spotted his shortcomings. Wang glanced at his friend. He realized that Zi's plan was a new development in the gaming industry. The guy thought with displeasure that his plan looked mediocre. After thinking for a bit, the programmer told himself that he needed to keep trying. Jai turned around and asked his friend, "Do I really need to keep working?" Wang told his interlocutor that he should continue in the same spirit. Wang smiled and told his colleague that the research and development time could be reduced. Their development would be completely new. Van suggested to his friend that more effort should be put into the issue of artistic resources. She was actively working on the keyboard. He said he would create a design project and prepare a list of resources. She turned around and told his friend that he would like to apply for 2 million. Van replied to his friend that it's always worth trying. In terms of quality, the more one invests, the better the result. He was sitting in his office in a large building. He was busy with work. Pei looked at the book and decided that he needed to consider something else. He got angry. He tore the book up in frustration. At that moment, he remembered the girl Lin Wang and teacher Qiao. Pei assumed Qiao lived in the capital and belonged to the Beibiao clan. Life was hard for the teacher at first. After moving to Eli Island, he was able to amass a huge fortune thanks to a daily nutrition program. He recalled that Qiao became popular thanks to Tengda. He personally had no influence on the course of events. He thought about it and realized that the man had a lot of influence. He could be bribed, but it was unclear what to do next. The drink got angry. He realized with displeasure that the man would doubt him. He realized he couldn't hide his hatred for Qiao. After the game's release, the budget was overflowing. Lin saved hundreds of thousands in rent. The guy decided that the girl had acted very frivolously, considering that her brother had given her 200,000. Pei thought it was better to follow the plan and send the girl abroad. He imagined Lin working on games abroad. There, she would fail and return to her homeland. Then, she would inherit a fortune and live happily ever after. He continued to think. He realized that he needed to consider all possible options. He decided that Jinyang Games would start losing money and would no longer provide free rent. The boss told Shin's assistant on the phone to invite Lin Wang to his place. The door to the office opened very slowly. A girl was getting ready to go in. Lin shouted very discontentedly to her boss that she was not going anywhere. He glanced at the worker. He thought that the other girls would cry with happiness if they found out they were getting a promotion. But Lin flatly refused. The worker looked at the boss and said that her current abilities would not be enough. The girl said she wants to stay with the company. She's waiting for the release of a game called Look Back, The Shore is There, and plans to gain experience. Pei was unpleasantly frightened. He realized that his first plan had failed. He was unhappy because the second-generation rich were very nasty. The boss told his subordinate that people in their company underestimated their abilities. He told the girl that he was putting her in charge of the Shangyang games. Lin was very happy. She couldn't believe that the boss gave her a new assignment. He walked around the office. He told the girl that they had recently bought out a money-losing gaming company. It needed to be rehabilitated. The boss explained to his subordinate that changes couldn't be made in a hurry. It wouldn't be that easy. He pointed his finger at the girl and said that he was entrusting her with important tasks. The boss demanded that the girl push the leader of Z to make unpopular decisions. Lin will also become their ambassador. Pei told the girl that he hoped she would turn the unprofitable company around, resolve all the problems, and solve the benefit issues. He asked the girl if she was afraid of difficulties. Lin looked at her boss and replied in a confident voice that she was not afraid of anything. The boss looked at his subordinate with great joy. He was pleased with her. Lin turned to the boss and asked if she could go back to Tengda later. He raised his finger. He told the girl that her place in the company would always be reserved for her. She could return at any time. The girl joyfully shouted to the boss that she accepted his assignment. Lin turned and headed towards the exit. He watched her silently. Pei was very pleased. He looked ahead with a joyful gaze. He sat down in the chair. He said that only Xiaoyang remained for him. Pei thought to herself that the girl's weakness was that she was so obsessed with personal growth. The task would be too difficult for her. She wouldn't be able to handle it and would leave. Pei sat and leafed through a book. He happily said that the current danger had already been eliminated. He had settled everything. He slammed the book shut. He told himself that he would go to an internet cafe. Pei went inside the internet cafe. It was located on Minyan Mountain. He opened the door and went inside the cafe. He decided to rest there a little. Pei walked inside the cafe and collapsed very tiredly on top of the counter. He was sitting inside a cafe. There were tables and computers for work. Pei thought joyfully to himself that this is exactly how everything should look. The waiter approached with a tray. He brought coffee for the visitors at the table. The guys were sitting next to each other. They didn't understand why the boss had appointed them to meet in this place. The guy knew that the Minion shop had the worst performance and a lot of losses. He decided that the boss wanted to turn losses into profit. Ma told his friend that they needed to make the Minion shop prosper. Ma told his boss in a joyful voice that he had good news. He became agitated. He told his friend to speak with great interest. Ma said in a joyful voice that their revenue from alcohol sales had increased and all losses had been covered. They had started making a profit. The guy said that when everyone found out about Chen Lei, many local performers wanted to move in with him. Things were looking up. He thought he had already foreseen this situation. This kind of thing only happens in internet cafes. Ma threw a huge amount of money in front of him. He shouted that they could become popular in the future. They would transform the internet cafe. This would help increase revenue. He got angry. He put his cup on the table and told his friends that he didn't agree. Pei shouted excitedly to his friend Ma, saying that he was thinking very narrowly. The guy looked happily at his boss. He had already thought that Pei would be against it. A friend placed his hand on the protagonist's shoulder. He thought that Ma had never understood the boss's intentions before. The guy held a cup of drink in front of him. He thought that the boss would expand the number of internet cafes. He would distribute them across the cities. He asked his friend how the delivery was going. The guy replied that everyone was leaving good reviews. Customers reported that they liked the food and gave it high marks. Ma looked at the boss with a smile and said that they were still very far from profit. The guy looked at his boss with great attention. He thought it was impossible to turn a profit in such a short time. The employee was surprised that the boss only asked about delivery. He didn't mention branches. The guy thought the boss only wanted to do delivery. He would use the popularity of the internet cafe to increase his income. Pei jumped to his feet. He told his friends that they would now take up logistics. He wanted to start a company. The friends were very surprised. They listened with interest to what he would tell them. Pei explained to his interlocutors in a cheerful voice that the company would be called Headwind Freight Transportation. Ma and his friend sat and looked at the main character in silence and surprise. I asked my friend with great fear, is it really true that they don't have logistics in place yet? Pei replied to his friend that the name Headwind is very suitable for flying. He pointed with his hands and shouted that their name meant takeoff. The guy was deep in thought. He couldn't keep up with his boss's thoughts. The worker recalled thinking the boss wanted to develop other industries. Ma thought to himself with concern that internet cafe deliveries were not working well. So the boss decided to scale up. He told his friends that the project might be too big and the current money might not be enough. Pei gave a thumbs up and said he had no plans to create a national trucking company. He explained to his friends that for now, they would focus on Jingzhou and its surroundings. Pei thought to himself that an online shopping platform already exists, but it's not developed yet. He thought that most of the express delivery industry was in a state of rapid growth. Pei said to himself that the pickup point called Stupid Bird and others were not that far away. He imagined a courier arriving at his door with a package. He thought that door-to-door delivery wasn't considered honorable work. As a result, couriers prefer to shift all the costs onto customers. He told himself that no one wants to do dirty work. The reason is that couriers don't make money doing it. The boss told workers that about 100 outlets would be opened in the city of Jingzhou in the early stages. He took the cup in his hands. He said that they would later talk about cooperation with courier companies. Pei thought to himself that their company would start delivering goods door to door. He calculated that they would receive 200 to 300 orders daily, resulting in an approximate monthly profit of 3,000 yen. Pei thought to himself that his company's employees would receive increased pay. A larger number of people would also be hired. Customers would not have to pick up their goods in person. As a result, there would be less traffic and costs would decrease. Pei calculated that his net profit would be about 1,000. If he opened 100 points, it would cost him 3 million. His monthly loss would be 7 to 800,000. The subordinate looked at the boss with optimism and thought that he was very smart. He must have long-term prospects for the project. The guy thought that until the last kilometer problem was solved, Pei would continue to lose money. The employee thought that in the future, some clients might switch to the headwind. Perhaps they'll go national. The guy looked at the boss and decided that he was a real role model. There was a girl sitting in the building inside the office of the Shangyang Games Company. Lin sat alone in her office as the development director. Lin sat at her desk. She was bored and stretched tiredly. The worker got tired and lay down on the table. She told herself that she didn't understand what she was doing. The girl really didn't like the game. She told herself that this game had hit rock bottom. Lin was working on her laptop. She didn't think that everything could be so bad. Lin told herself in a dissatisfied voice that she wouldn't be able to figure all this out. There was a knock at the door. The guy told the girl that her boss had invited her to a meeting. Lin became agitated. She joyfully shouted from her seat to her colleague that she was already on her way. The girl told herself that her boss had relied on her. She couldn't let him down. A meeting was taking place at the table. The boss sat at the head of the table. His subordinates were standing around him. The guy told his subordinates that they needed to discuss the development plan for a game called Song of the Bloody Battle. The boss looked at the girl and decided to find out what she thought about all this. The guy didn't believe that the designer Pei sent him couldn't make any corrections. Lin sat and was very bored. She did not understand what the boss was telling her. The girl forced herself to calm down. She wasn't involved in game development and therefore didn't understand something. The guy held the documents in his hands and told his subordinates that the budget for purchasing the necessary resources was 2 billion. The boss turned to the girl and told her to look. He expected her to say something. The guy silently turned around and looked at the tench. The girl didn't answer him. Lin smiled and answered the boss in a cheerful voice that there were no problems with the rest. The girl looked at the boss and said that there might be a problem with the budget. The boss looked at his subordinate silently. Van remained silent and looked back at him. The boss thought to himself that there might be a problem with the budget. Van looked at the boss and decided that 2 million was a large sum for the project. The boss handed the girl some documents and said that this was a spreadsheet of the current budget. He added that they could lose 300,000 or 400,000. Lin glanced at the documents with fear. She studied them carefully. The girl said in a calm voice that she would approve the project if it required 4 million. Lin handed the boss a document. She said she needed about 5 million so that there would be no questions in the future. The meeting participants were surprised. They looked at the girl silently and with distrust. The boss came to his senses. He told the girl in a frightened voice that 5 million would be too much. Van said in a sly voice that there was no need for that amount of money. He decided that 2 million would be enough. Lin explained in a stern voice that details were very important to Pei's boss. She advised him to listen to her and ask for 5 million. The boss turned to his subordinate and said that everything needed to be reconsidered. Van agreed that some changes needed to be made. The girl excitedly understood why Boss Pei had sent her to this place. Lin decided to herself that she had to infuse the spirit of Tengda into this company. The girl took a closer look and decided that Ji looked very similar to Lu Mingliang in the past. The girl thought her boss was too busy to come in and make changes, so she was sent here to practice her skills and correct mistakes. The guy said that if we increase the budget to 5 million, another problem arises. Even if we hire other high-quality artists, we still won't be able to spend the money. Van happily said that they are now using 2Ds for the official platform. This version is not of good quality. The girl excitedly advised the workers to use 3Ds. The boss explained that the volume of files being transferred would increase sharply, and the internet speed would not be able to handle it. The worker said with concern that if there was a large volume of data, the internet speed would not be sufficient. The guy explained that if users are going to spend a lot of time browsing pages, then it's better to conduct end-to-end reviews. Van replied to his colleagues that if they used 3D graphics, it would be possible to create a client and an application. The guy explained that gamers would need to download a lot of resources, and the demands would be high. The boss said that both sides might be dissatisfied. The girl sat at the table and continued writing. She knew the design project had already been finalized and couldn't be changed indiscriminately. Lin thought about it and decided to herself that the only right solution would be a mini-app. Suddenly, part of the girl's consciousness protested against her thought. Lin decided that the player using the mini-app wouldn't get a high-quality image. She didn't know what to do. The girl closed her eyes and told herself that she needed to calm down. The girl decided that he could help her now. She dreamed about what the boss would do in this situation. Lin suddenly opened her eyes sharply. She realized that a new idea had occurred to her. The girl jumped up and told her colleagues they would create a mini-app. The design would remain the same, but the graphics would be upgraded to 3D. The worker thought that if her assumptions were correct, then everything should work out for them. The employees started communicating with each other. Lin glanced at them and decided that this was Tengda's employee development. The guy was sitting in the office at the computer and was working on it very concentratedly. She looked happily at the computer. He decided that spending the large budget turned out to be very difficult. Suddenly, the sound of an incoming message was heard on the guy's desktop. He asked his interlocutor how he was doing. Ji was delighted and said that he could now share everything. Pei wrote to the guy telling him to keep working. If he had any questions, he could contact Director Lin. Ji happily told himself that the design director had been sent by Pei's boss himself. He was delighted after communicating with his interlocutor. He clapped his hands with pleasure. Pei thought happily that the girl had done everything. He would spend a lot of money and would be able to use the mini-app system. He grabbed the can of drink. He thought they had never used this method before. Pei opened the can of drink and prepared to drink it. He was pleased with the work done. He held the jar in his hands. He thought that they would spend 5 million now, and then another 2 or 3 million on promotion. There was a very loud knock at the door. He told the guest to come in. A guy named Van came in and told the boss that preparations for the new network were complete. He invited him to take a look. Van handed the document to his boss. He told him the details of all the financial expenses. He took all the documents in his hands and held them out in front of him. Pei asked his subordinate with a smile, "What are the problems?" Van looked at the boss and explained calmly that they only had 2 problems. The employees sat in the office near their computers. They tried to get work done. Van explained to the boss in a disgruntled voice that their editors were currently insufficiently qualified. When selecting manuscripts, they were more inclined to favor beautiful handwriting. The employee explained to the boss that it would be very difficult to change all of this in a short period of time. Everything had to be done gradually. He was sitting in a chair. He asked his subordinate, "What is the second problem?" Van explained to his boss with a smile that the manuscripts were of low quality and that most of them would not receive good grades. The employee thought for a moment. He told his boss that he was not assessing the situation, but simply stating a fact. He asked his subordinate with great interest to show him the manuscripts. Van excitedly handed the guy a flash drive. He said it contained the first part of the manuscripts. He sat down at the computer and analyzed the information he received with great attention. Pei was very dissatisfied. He noted to himself that there were many typos in the text. Pei was very unhappy. He didn't say anything to the guy. Van decided to himself that the boss was very patient. He unexpectedly joyfully held out the flash drive in front of him and said that it was a small problem. Van was very surprised. He held the flash drive and looked at the boss. Pei explained to the employee with a smile that the most important thing for them was to expand the library. People would want to sign contracts with them, so there was no need to be so harsh on them. The guy reminded his boss that he had previously set the price at 1,000 yuan. Unlimited access cost 500 yuan. But everyone was required to regularly update and add to the site. Van reminded his boss that they had to deliver results to users. The guy explained that if they lowered the price, they wouldn't be able to make any money. The boss told his subordinate that if they brought in 500 authors, it would only be an extra 500,000 yuan a month. Pei jumped to his feet and said they were a new platform. People wouldn't visit a site that had almost nothing on it. 3,000 characters a day would be a difficult task for beginners. He patted the guy on the shoulder and told him not to worry. If there were manuscripts, they would cope. The worker looked happily and realized that he was right. The probability of a miss is very low. The guy worriedly told his boss that the problem was still very pressing. There weren't many authors at the moment. The issue with manuscripts had still not been resolved. He explained to his subordinate with a smile that he and his colleagues could sit down and write something. He approached the window and told the employee that the goal of Tengda is to work for pleasure. If there is no work, then you can spend time on a hobby. If the workload is very high, then you can hire more people. The subordinate nervously replied to his boss that he understood him. Von thought to himself that he had ended up spending a lot of money and not doing anything worthwhile. He felt terrible. The guy looked at the boss and thought that it was very good to have such a good leader. The subordinate jumped into the elevator and rode up to the 18th floor, where the big office was located. On the 18th floor, in the office where the social network was being designed, there were many workers. Van was taking me inside the office with documents. He shouted that we needed to have a short 5-minute meeting. The guy sat down at the table. He said that the boss told them to lower the price for accepting manuscripts. They need to attract as many authors as possible. A student named Juan Singh told his interlocutor that he had finished reviewing today's manuscripts. The guy explained to his colleagues that this was what he was planning to talk about. If they realized the work was finished, they could pursue their hobby and write their own text. The employees were very surprised. They didn't understand what they could write. Van happily told his colleagues that they could leave their own recommendations on the website. Van suddenly became thoughtful. He decided that if the workers didn't want to write stories, they could be assigned other work. One of the employees ran up to Ma and fell to his knees. He demanded that he not leave, as the development of the plot of the new game was not yet finished. Van thought to himself that he could do everything himself, but the quality wouldn't be the best. The guy glanced at his colleagues. He remembered that there were people on the team who were well-versed in classical literature, and Xing would be suitable for this. The guy happily told his colleagues that he had another job for them that would interest them. Van asked the developers if they had heard of a game called Look Back. There's a shore there? There was a very dark sky and clouds above the abandoned land. A small black bird was sitting on the ground. In ancient China, there was a small, quiet village. People there suddenly began to lose their souls and become wandering ghosts. People in this village lost their memory and sanity. Afterwards, they attacked others. Evil and predatory zombies attacked their fellow villagers and killed them. The monsters gathered in huge flocks and unconsciously went to one place. This mysterious place had its own special name, the road to the other world. An old man sat near a tree. He said in a thoughtful voice that souls take the deceased to judgment. A warrior stood behind him. The sage said in a thoughtful voice that for some reason spirits no longer take the dead. Therefore the dead only walk along the road to the other world and are unable to enter the afterlife. Wandering souls are inspired by the underworld, but cannot find the way to it. They become enraged, and the world turns into purgatory. The ordinary soul of a deceased person is no longer considered at rest. It constantly feels as if someone is calling it. To avoid becoming a will-less ghost, one must embark on the path to the afterlife and journey to the afterlife. The ancient warrior stood and looked ahead at the magical portal. Van told his colleagues that dilapidated temples and statues would appear randomly during the game. The game would not glorify Buddha. The end of the age of Dharma would be depicted. The guy told his colleagues that there was some more information. He could share it after the meeting. Van asked his friends who was interested, and Chair jumped up and raised his hand. He shouted that he was interested, and suggested posting the game's content on their website. This could be considered an official introduction to the game. The guy suggested splitting the task into several parts. Each worker would be responsible for a specific piece of content. There would be various bosses and non-player characters with their own stories. The guy was really happy. He said the game was going to be awesome. Van suggested his friends take a closer look at the plot of a game called Look Back, Same Shore. They would meet weekly to discuss the development and plot. The people at the table were very happy. They shouted joyfully and expressed support. In the company's office in a large building, workers were sitting and relaxing in a cafe. On July the 13th, the developers were taking a break in the morning. The guys were sitting around happily chatting with each other. The man looked around the cafe and said it was very lively. He liked the way the place used to be. The waiter approached the customers and placed a cup on the table. He said it was coffee for them. The guy brought it in a glass and put it on the table for the client. It was a drink. The client sat and happily took a photo of something on her phone. The man thought things were going well here. Daily takings, including drinks and a portion of the proceeds going to the musicians. The guest looked around in surprise and did not know where the director was, who was supposed to be overseeing all of this. The client called the waiter over. The waiter asked the man how he could help him. The guest asked the guy, did the MA director really not come to see them today? The worker replied that the director hadn't shown up for about a week. The man was surprised. He realized that the director was only in the cafe when there was a large influx of customers. As soon as the flow stabilized, the director stopped passing. The guest asked the guy, where's their director now? The worker explained that the manager had gone to Minyan. The man calmly answered the waiter that he was just asking him. The waiter abruptly turned away from the customer and walked away. The man looked after him for a long time. The man remembered that Minyan is an elite, honest sector on the outskirts of the city. It has beautiful nature. Everything else suffers greatly. This place is not suitable for opening a branch. The guest stood up. He thought the director was considering Minyan as his next business location. The man wondered what Pei was planning to do this time. The man called his subordinates and demanded that they send 3 waiters to the Minyan Internet Cafe. On July 14th, he came to a country internet cafe. He had a meeting there. The workers greeted their boss very joyfully. They were glad that he came. The waiter came up with a cup on a tray. He told the boss that he had brought coffee for him. The workers lined up and looked at the boss. Pei thought joyfully that the waiters had no work. He happily told his friends that the waiters would receive 1,000 won bonus this month. The guys were very surprised. They couldn't understand why they were entitled to a bonus. He told his subordinates that he wanted to encourage them. The indicators weren't very good, so they needed to try harder. Pei said confidently to his subordinates so they wouldn't worry. They'd be able to get their internet cafe up and running. The waiters were very happy and shouted. They thanked their boss. The guys calmed down. They looked at each other with great excitement. One of the workers told the protagonist that the stranger wanted to bribe him to find out the truth about their branch. Another worker said excitedly that they wanted to bribe him too. Another guy raised his hand. He was surprised. He couldn't understand who could need information about the failing branch. He asked the employees with interest how much money they were offered for information about the branch. The waiter said in a frightened voice that he had been offered 3,000 for urgent information. He was amazed when he heard about such a sum of money. He didn't understand why he himself hadn't met this man yet. Pei was deep in thought. He couldn't understand what kind of person could buy information for 3,000 yen. He decided that Minyan might have a fan. The waiter told the boss that they wouldn't sell the internet cafe. He refused the offer. Another employee said they wouldn't tell anyone anything. The workers took turns happily convincing the boss to believe them. He thought that if someone wanted to buy any information, it would put the Minyan branch at a disadvantage. That way, they could lose even more. Pei raised his glass of wine. He told his subordinates to agree. The workers were very surprised. They looked at the boss with astonished glances. Pei told the waiters that they could sell the information. They could ask the customer to pay several times more. One of the waiters said excitedly that the boss had a cunning plan. He wanted to give the competitors false information. He looked at his phone. He decided to tell the stranger the real truth. The guy activated the voice recording function on his phone. He decided to record the conversation. Pei put the phone on the table. He told the employees that they could now talk about the internet cafe's plans. The phone was recording the conversation. He said that in the coming months, Minyan will be their priority. They mainly specialize in drinks. He reminded his friend M.A. that he wanted to turn the internet cafe into a bar, but he had previously disagreed. Pei explained to his surprised subordinate that internet cafes were still in demand. The boss happily told the workers that their internet cafe model would become very popular. He looked happily at the waiters. He thought that achieving a high-quality internet cafe development model would be impossible for several years. The guy thought to himself that it took 12 years to get rid of regular internet cafes. Pei thought to himself that he still had 2 years left to incur large losses. He could think about the future later. The waiters exchanged glances. The guy told them he'd chosen Mingyu for development. This branch brings in the least revenue. He extended his hand forward. He said they needed to focus on the nearby luxury residential buildings and universities. Minyan would become a luxury vacation spot. A worker ran up and asked the boss what they should do. He told his interlocutor to wait for customers and serve them. He pressed the stop recording button on his phone. He said everything he wanted. Pei handed the phone to his subordinate. He told him to pass the recordings on to the waiters. The excited MI replied that he would do so. He looked at his phone. He realized that thanks to the recording, the other side would have no doubts. Late in the evening, a man was sitting in his office in a large building. The office owner sat at the table and listened attentively to the audio recording on his phone. He thought he'd gotten the same information from 3 waiters. But that didn't matter to him anymore. The businessman lit a cigarette. He thought that Pei would act as he had previously assumed. High-class cafes will become my mainstream in the future. The man remembered that Minyan was considered an unlucky elite district. He realized that he had decided to rely on luck. The businessman exhaled smoke. He thought the cafe's location was also very inconvenient. The man stubbed out his cigarette. He realized that customers wouldn't travel far for a simple internet cafe. The businessman recalled that the singer had helped the main character promote the cafe last time. The man prepared to light a cigarette. He remembered that Boss Pei often visited Minyan and wanted to change the place. The businessman thought that a busy person would not waste precious time on simple entertainment. After some thought, the man reached for the phone. He had made some decision. The businessman told his subordinates to go to Minyan and invest in some establishments. They also needed to contact Mr. Zhang and Mr. Shi to see if they needed any help. The businessman hung up the telephone. He was delighted. The man leaned back in his chair. He decided that he would follow the protagonist's example. The businessman thought that if the guy lost, he would end up making a profit. On July 18th, he was lying on his couch at home. He was looking at his phone and wondering with interest whether the stranger had moved. Pei thought that a competitor would try to crush his internet cafe. He would invest in a nearby establishment. As a result, the flow of customers would decrease. He figured it would take about a week to prepare for the headwind. He had a lot to decide. The guy thought that the Swan Lake restaurant no longer met the catering requirements. An additional restaurant needed to be opened. He imagined himself talking to himself. He told himself that there were a lot of such establishments now, and they even wrote about them online. The guy suggested spending a lot of money, but in a way that the system wouldn't notice. Pei reached for his chopsticks. He said the losses wouldn't be that great. We need to position ourselves further from the center. The guy decided that he needed to open a place near Minyan. Pei happily told himself that Minyan Villa was the one losing the most money, so the location was perfect. He also thought about opening near the Beijian district. The guy raised his chopsticks and said that they would put together a menu at exorbitant prices. People would leave a lot of money with them. The ingredients had to be fresh. Pei announced happily that they would order a lot of ingredients and wait for them to spoil. Pei said in a cheerful voice that they would be preparing a lot of different dishes. But everything was only by pre-order. The guy happily concluded that ordinary customers wouldn't be able to afford this, so they'd leave. Pei happily suggested to himself that he could spend money on expensive chefs. The losses would be very large. He jumped up happily near the sofa and said that this would be a good opportunity to spend some money. The guy picked up the phone. He decided to contact my friend as soon as possible. He told his friend to go for a walk with him in the next few days and find a place for a restaurant. On a clear day, Pei and his friends walked along the city streets. Pei pointed his finger to the side and said that there was a good place next to them. Zhang said fearfully that the establishment had closed. Zhang followed his boss and didn't understand why he chose the Minyan Villa as his location. Zhang looked around and noticed that there was nothing around. No fool would travel so far just to get something to eat. Zhang looked to the side with great attention. He and his friend were heading forward. Zhang excitedly shouted to his friends to look over there. There was a new building there. The guy pointed down the street and shouted that there was also a new building further on. Ma looked around fearfully. He remembered that a couple of days ago everything there was closed. Zhang happily told his friends that a cafe would be opening here. The guy pointed his finger to the side and said that there would be a bar and a snack bar there. The subordinate ran up to his boss and said joyfully that he had a diamond eye. He was very surprised. The guy reminded him that a couple of days ago, he had told him that the area would be developed. Chang stood outside, very happy. He thought that when the time comes, a high-class restaurant will open here. Then, guests will go to the bar for drinks. He couldn't understand who could have done such a thing. The area was deserted, and someone had invested money here to open a cafe and bar. Pei thought to himself that a restaurant between a cafe and a bar would look out of place. He suddenly decided to himself that all this was done by the person who was interested in his internet cafe. He waved to his friends and told them to go and have another look. Chang was surprised. He thought that the presence of stores should be a plus for the restaurant. The worker was surprised. He decided that there must be something else here. He didn't understand why the boss left. Pei asked his subordinates if there was a Minyan Villa in the Beijian area. The friends looked at the protagonist in silence. They didn't know what to say to him. Pei stood with his workers on the road. They looked at the houses in front of them. He and his friends were in the sales office of the Minyan Villa. The guys were sitting on the sofas in the office. The secretary brought them tea on a tray. Chang held a cup in his hands. He couldn't understand what his boss was planning. He visited the Minyan Villa and decided to buy a place for himself right away. The guy looked at the boss. He thought that this place wasn't that easy to find. Pei thought to himself that no one would have expected there to be a restaurant in the Beijian district. The system had stipulated that he couldn't buy real estate. But he was investing in starting a business, and everything should be fine. Very soon, a man with a secretary appeared in front of the guests. The girl was carrying a large folder in her hands. The secretary told the main character that Director Tsui was in front of them. He extended his hand to the director and apologized for disturbing him. Kui told the boy that they were very glad that he was interested in the Minyu Villa. He sat down on the sofa and began to tell his interlocutor his plan. The secretary approached the director and carefully poured tea from the teapot into his cup. Tsui asked the main character how many plans he had if he didn't come alone. Pei asked his interlocutor, Is it possible to rent the very top of the Beijian district? The man was very surprised by this question. His hand holding the tea even started shaking. Sui wiped the spilled tea on his suit with a handkerchief. He couldn't understand who would think of renting property in such a remote place. Sui told clients that they were selling the property, not renting it out. He told the director with a smile that he would be able to buy real estate next time. The owner was angry with the system. He liked the building, but he couldn't rent it. He looked closely at the system window. He was thinking about real estate. The system informed the owner that if he wanted to make a purchase for the benefit of the company's development, there were no restrictions. Pei thought happily to himself that the system didn't mind. Sui was very surprised because the guy wanted to buy real estate from him. He repeated to the director that he wanted to buy real estate and asked how much it would cost him. Sui was very surprised by such words. The man pulled out a large photograph for the boy. He told him that the price for one space would be 12,000. The final price would be 6,300,000. He looked at his interlocutor and explained that it wouldn't be that expensive for him. The man held a catalog of photographs in his hands. He remembered that this property had been unavailable for sale for several years. He told the director that they needed to take a good look at everything now. Sui waved his hand and told the customers to follow him. He and his friends climbed up to the building on the mountain. There was no one around. Pei stood and looked joyfully ahead. His surprised friends stood behind him. The director thought to himself that it was very good for the guy to be rich. The client spent 7 million and wasn't even upset. The director told the guy in a sly voice that the building was located near the northwest gate of Beijian. Drink answered the man in an absolutely calm voice that it was great for him. The guy told the main character that they still had time. They could look at other locations for the restaurant. He said to the guy in a confident voice that everything was decided. They would settle here. Cheng was very surprised. He didn't understand why they were building a restaurant in such a crowded place. Sui asked the director if he could open a restaurant in such a place. The director slyly told the boy that this wouldn't be the best idea. He promised that if the boy paid the full amount up front, he would talk to the owners of the other buildings. He picked up the phone. He told the director that he would send his assistant to him now. Very soon a car pulled up from the side. A girl arrived in it. A blue girl got out of the car. She looked around and went towards the main character. Pei told his assistant that the signs needed to be sorted out. Sin told the guy that she understood everything. Shin asked the director what else they needed to decide. Sui asked the girl to wait. He sat and looked at his phone. He still had about 8 million left. That would be enough to buy a Baekhyun. But a company also needs a lot of money. He decided that the Ocean Fortress game could sell some epic weapons. The boss told his subordinates to put all their efforts into developing a new weapon for the game. The circulation should be 10,000 copies. He calculated to himself that to earn 6 million, he needed to sell 10,000 copies. If he invested in Beijing, it shouldn't affect his profit chain. The guy was lying on a chair by the pool, watching the girl. She was talking to the director. He thought to himself that everything could work out for him as early as next month. He thought slyly to himself that on the 1st of August, there would be an awards ceremony for the best employees. He would need to inspire everyone. The girl was inside a large building in her office. Lin was sitting in the development director's office. She was getting ready to get to work. The girl sat at the table in the work wing and tiredly stretched her arms up. Lin thought she would work on a game called Song of Bloody Battle. This game should boost sales and increase the audience. The worker grabbed the mouse and started playing the game. She couldn't understand why people invested money in this game and not others. Lin thought to herself that she understood why Pei had decided to buy out the unprofitable company. The girl realized that he had decided to conduct an experiment with a game called the Song of the Bloody Battle. Lin continued the virtual battle on the computer. She decided that Pei hoped that the players wouldn't become slaves to money and hatred. The girl said that the company makes money because it sells exclusive items to local rich people. The girl decided to herself that the entire system was built for the rich. Players had luxurious equipment, golden wings, and the title of king. Lin thought that her boss had decided not to make money, but to equalize. He would take exclusive items from the rich and give them to ordinary players. The girl realized that the guy had spent a considerable amount of money on the second part of the Bloody Battle song. It compensates for the main shortcomings of the first game. The worker said to herself with the satisfaction that they were going on a smoke break according to the rules. There was a knock at the door. The guy asked Lin if he could talk to her. 2 workers entered the room. The girl asked, what was their reason for coming? The guy sat down on the chair. He told the girl that they came to discuss advertising. Van explained to his interlocutor that the game's release was still over a month away, but he needed to prepare for the advertising in advance. Lin looked at her interlocutors in surprise and suggested that they discuss it. The employee told the girl that the best way to buy advertising is online. It needs to be published on various websites. It should appear immediately after a visit to the website. The girl was unhappy. She asked the workers if they really wanted to use annoying advertising for promotion. The employee explained to the interviewer that the problem was inconvenience. A pop-up window would appear in front of players. Customers would be required to download an installation package, which would reduce the number of downloads. Van adjusted his glasses and said that this was a very serious problem. We needed to come up with an alternative. The girl happily thought that even such an unsuccessful advertising option would help reduce the number of clicks on the game page. Lynn explained to her interlocutor with excitement that she would talk to the boss. The girl grabbed the phone in her hands and started writing messages to her boss. Lynn informed the boss that the development of the song Bloody Battles was going well. They needed to make some announcements. The girl pressed the phone to her hand. She thought the answer would come in a few days. Lynn noticed that she had received a message on her phone. She was surprised that the boss responded to her quickly. Van looked at his friend and said that Boss Pei could really have foreseen and come up with everything. At this time, the printer in the office began printing paper documents. The girl approached the printer. She noticed that a document had arrived from the boss. She handed the papers to the guys. Lynn and the workers were very surprised. They carefully read the documents. After a short pause, the guy said the advertising plan wasn't the best. Van reported that the boss had suggested they spend as much money as possible on advertising. The girl carefully read the document. She was surprised by the content of the advertising plan. Lynn read the message. The boss wrote the text of the future advertisement for her. The guy happily told the girl that the boss responded very quickly. He didn't understand why Pei had chosen this method of advertising. Van said thoughtfully that most players would be wealthy. They would have liked to have celebrities promoting the game. But now, perhaps their target audience will be less wealthy. The workers were lost in thought. They looked away, each thinking about something of their own. The girl was very happy. She shouted loudly to her friends that she understood. Lynn jumped up and shouted that the boss's goal wasn't to stop players being slaves to money. Pei wanted customers to change their tastes. The guy said that the boss wants to attract the target audience to the game, and then change these people. Van said excitedly that this was precisely why Boss had decided to go with such a high level of publicity. Everyone would know about the game, and everyone would be able to play it. Lynn said with a big smile that their boss always goes against the rules. In the office, workers were sitting at computers and busy with work. He thought that the girl didn't answer him. This meant there were no problems. Pei looked happily at his phone. He decided that this advertising method was the most effective. He cleverly thought that games would also work as commercials. You could add a character and phrases like, "I'll be in the bathroom soon." Pei thought joyfully to himself that all of this is very illegal, and the system will not allow such a thing to happen. Pei told himself that he would need to turn to celebrities for support. The best players are middle-aged people. He removed the lid from the cup. He thought it was crucial to choose the right celebrities and slogans. They would help attract the target audience. Pei happily told himself that his plan could bear good fruit. He said that Lin could be allowed to film the commercial himself. A small player said that Bloody Battle 2 should appeal to those who primarily played the first game. In the second game, you can kill everyone, and the image quality has improved. Everything looks just like in real life. Pei held the remote in his hands and said that old players are keeping an eye on updates. They'll know when a new version is out. The boy controlled the joystick and said that even if they spend a lot of money on celebrities, it does not mean that the number of players will increase. The guy looked at the book. He decided that he needed to convince old players not to play the new game. Only advertising could turn them away. One of the kids raised his hand and said that such investments were a waste of money. Pei looked at the monitor. He realized that he could only be sure of the Shangyang game. A guy knocked on the office door and asked if he could come in. The boss told the visitor he could come in. The guest was holding a flash drive. He told the boss that he could show him the sketches for the game. Look around. The shore's right there. The guy handed the boss a flash drive and said the students had made a lot of adjustments this time. They would soon finish another project. The priority would be high-quality completion of the work, not the deadline. The guy put the flash drive into the laptop and decided to explain what was in the folder. He looked at the game with great surprise. He was very impressed. Pei looked closely at the game. He saw a bunch of game characters against the dark sky in the mountains. Suddenly, a huge demon with a horse's head appeared in the center of the game. A yellow pentagram surrounded him. A warrior with a sword stood below. A magician appeared near the hanging bridge. He was holding a staff with a human skull in his hands. The worker impatiently asked the boss what he thought. The worker remained silent in response. After a short pause, he angrily replied to his interlocutor that all this looked good. The guy thought happily to himself that he had done his best this time. He turned around and forced a smile. He decided to encourage his subordinate. He said angrily to himself that he would like to stop collaborating. The guy excitedly asked his boss what he thought about it. He replied that the artists had done their best, and there was no reason to refuse. The boss handed the flash drive to the worker and said they needed to watch more. He thought the players should be impressed by the difficulty of the gameplay. He was willing to spend a lot of money on it. After a short pause, Pei handed the flash drive to his subordinate. The worker looked at the boss and said that he should like the game. The guy told his boss that Mr. Ruin would like to come and see how things were going. Pei explained to his interlocutor that when Ruin arrived, he would be able to entertain him. He thought to himself that he did not want to see this guest. The worker held the flash drive in front of him and headed for the exit. He continued working at his desk. Pei stood and looked ahead. He thought that there would be no problem with the game. Look back, there's a shore. But he still had 3 urgent matters to attend to. He remembered that he needed to reward the most successful employees on the 1st of August. Pei remembered that there was still one project that wasn't ready. Someone needed to be assigned to it. He remembered the 200,000 from Lin Chan. He decided that it was time for him to think everything over. Pei held a wad of money in his hands. He realized that he needed to start today. He was sitting at his desk at home and writing documents. He was completely focused. Pei wrote silently with his hand on a piece of paper using a pen the word about independence. He ended up writing on a piece of paper about an independent audit of companies. The guy read the document carefully. He wrote about independent audits of companies. He used a small piece of tape to stick the document to his glasses. Pei looked ahead and said that it was not bad for him. The piece of paper had a note about a hardcore gamer. He picked up the phone and said on video that it was time to start. Pei reported into the camera that he was talking about an independent audit, day 1. He was holding a document in his hands. Pei tossed the document aside and welcomed everyone to the most professional and discerning company in the country. He called himself a professional auditor. He took out a box with a pineapple on top and threw it on the table. Pei grabbed a huge knife with his hand. He told the audience that they needed to carefully open the box. He swung his hand with the knife and hit the box from above. Pei threw the instructions aside. He said he wouldn't read them. He also threw the accessories aside. He glanced at his phone. He looked carefully at the exact time and date. The guy said that I needed to check the phone for water resistance. He brought it to the water. Pei threw the phone into the water with all his might. The device immediately sank to the bottom. He took the phone out of the water and said that the device was working fine. The guy climbed onto the sofa and said that now they would test the phone for durability. Pei dropped the device from a height of 1 meter onto the floor. Cracks appeared on the glass. He threw the phone onto the floor from a height of 2 meters and then from a height of 3 meters. Pei looked closely at the device. He told viewers that the phone remained undamaged after falling from several meters. He picked up the cutlery. He said they needed to test the phone's effectiveness in protecting it from impacts. Pei continued to bang forks and knives on the phone with all his might. He stuck a screwdriver into the phone and said that he would check it for disassembly. He decided to tell the phone. There were various phone parts lying on the table. The guy told the audience that this is what a pineapple looks like inside. He told viewers that he had tested Pineapple 4 in action, and the test was complete. Pei told viewers that they could see him in the next video. After the video broadcast, Pei took off his glasses tiredly. He told himself that everything went something like this. He said that I needed to edit the video and upload it to the website. He was sitting at his laptop. Pei told himself that he had to make Lin understand what kind of person he was. He was working on the keyboard. He said the prop fee would be 100,000 yuan. There would be 20 episodes with auditions. On a Tuesday in late July, he was sitting in his office in a large building. Pei happily thought that there were no leaks or exposures on the promotion account. Viewers watched the video of the disassembled phone and wrote various comments. Pei picked up a small bag of chips and opened it to try them. Pei ate the chips with gusto and thought that there wouldn't be many views for him. The system informed the owner that he had received income. The company's fixed assets would be recalculated. The guy was surprised. He thought that the recalculation would be due to the fact that he bought the premises for 6 million. Pei didn't understand why the system only now began to take such purchases into account. He thought to himself with displeasure that this was some kind of punishment for him. After a very long calculation, the guy realized that 2,430,000 was money that could still go into the red. The main 620,000 couldn't be lost. The system reported that she had funds in excess of 2,000, plus another 620,000. Pei didn't understand what this complication of the task was. Pei thought to himself that in the future, he wouldn't be able to lose 620,000 every day. He only wanted to take a small loss, but he was forced to worry a lot. The rules were becoming more and more complicated. He grabbed the phone and decided to call his assistant. Pei held the phone in his hands. He realized he had received a system message. This meant the formalities were over, and he needed to contact Shin's assistant. He walked with his friends along the pedestrian street of Minion Villa. Chang pointed his finger to the side and told the boss to look there. The guy pointed at the sign above the building. He explained that there was an internet cafe there too. Chang told the protagonist that competitors want to impersonate them, but they don't have new computers yet. Pei noticed some movement to the side. He looked there with interest. Several guys stood near the entrance to the building and handed out leaflets to passers-by. He was walking down the street. He thought happily that if all the shops around opened, no one would get to their internet cafe. The guy happily thought that a stranger was helping him lose money. He decided that all this could have been organized by Mr. Lee, whom he had seen in the cafe. Pei was very happy. He thought to himself that he could thank Mr. Lee. He and his friends approached the house on Quiet Street. The guy opened the door very wide in front of him and went inside the house. The worker told Mr. Pei that all his demands had been met. They tidied up the tables and other furniture. The worker smiled at the protagonist and asked what else they could add. Pei pointed to the side and said that a wine cabinet and a counter needed to be installed. The most expensive furniture needed to be placed in the hall. He told the worker that the garden could use less furniture and umbrellas. The subordinate listened very carefully to what he said and wrote it all down. Pei told his interlocutor that the restaurant should have a simple and a Chinese room. The restaurant also needs to thoroughly equip the Japanese and European halls. Pei explained to his subordinate that the plant room needed to be equipped. Various tablecloths, decorations, and dishes would be needed. The employee listened attentively to the boss. He explained that they needed to select the lighting style and design, along with preparing the menu list. He explained that most dishes must be ordered in advance, and that themed rooms need to be decorated in a specific style. Drink smartly. He told his subordinate that all dishes would be divided into 2 categories. Regular food would be consumed by the common staff. The restaurant will offer exquisite dishes. Customers will order them in advance and pay full price. The boss asked his subordinate, "Are there any questions?" The employee asked his interlocutor, "How can you prepare so many styles?" The guy told the boss that they already had everything they needed during meals. Pei shouted to his subordinate that everything was very important. He thought to himself that a good opportunity had appeared to spend a lot of money on nonsense. Pei calmly replied to his subordinate that the mood of the clients depends on the decorations and design. They must be 100% ready. He happily shouted that they were a high-class restaurant and details made all the difference. The employee said his boss's drive was the main guarantee of success. The subordinate promised his boss that when he returned, he would immediately begin preparations. He promised that he would take care of everything. Sin looked at the boss and asked him about the name of the restaurant. He thought for a moment and coughed. He didn't know what to answer the girl about the name. The boss looked at the girl and said that the name didn't matter. The protagonist's companions were very surprised when they heard such words. The employee asked the boss in bewilderment how the client would recommend the establishment to his friends. Cheng said with concern that there wouldn't be much traffic. If there wasn't a sign outside, people simply wouldn't come because they wouldn't know there was a restaurant inside. Sin explained that they would need a name for the restaurant anyway. He said angrily that they would rely on the quality of the food, not the big name. Pei told his subordinates that they would rely on the quality of the food, not the big name. He explained to his friends that good food is the key to success. They will advance if they serve customers well. The subordinates were very surprised. They looked at the boss with great bewilderment. He told his subordinate that he was handing over the restaurant to him. He would soon invite Tengda employees here for dinner. Pei headed for the exit. He thought happily to himself that no one would know about this establishment. He would feed the staff. The company's employees were located in a high-rise building. Twice a year, a selection of outstanding employees was held. The workers were very excited. They didn't know who would receive the award this time. One guy pleaded and clapped his hands together. He was hoping for second place. He entered the office with his subordinate. Shin told the workers that they needed to begin. Sin looked at the employees with interest and said that they would get started. He looked at the workers. He remembered that the prize fund was $1 million, along with a month of paid vacation. The employees were busy with work. He walked between the desks and looked at them. Blue came close to the main character and told him that everyone was ready. He clapped his hands. He decided to call the workers to attention. Pei loudly told all the workers that they were ready to announce the results. He brought the cup to a guy named Lu Mingliang. The worker was very surprised. Pei thought angrily to himself that he shouldn't break the rules. He told Lu that everyone voted for him. He handed the reward to the worker and told him to keep up the good work. Lu took the cup with trembling hands. He thought that for him this was not just an award, but also the trust of his superior. He was carrying a cup in his hands. He was approaching the second employee. The guy became very nervous. He didn't understand why the boss chose him. Pei presented the award to the employee with a smile. He congratulated Bao Ku on his honorable second place. Bao bowed to his boss and said that he could give the press to an employee who needed it more. He told his subordinate to pack his things. He was leaving in 3 days. Bao told his boss with excitement that he had already seen all the sights and had nowhere else to travel. Pei sternly told his subordinate that he should collect documents for a visa. He could go abroad and get to know another culture. Bao fell onto the table and grabbed his head with his hands. He didn't want to go anywhere. He approached the worker and asked him to say a few words. Lu jumped up and said that he was embarrassed to receive such an award. He was able to earn it thanks to his boss. The worker raised the cup above his head. He told the employees that if they work hard, they can achieve great things. He clapped for his subordinate. One of the guys shouted that he would listen more closely in future. Pei thought angrily to himself that the workers should obey him and not show initiative. He asked the worker how he decided to spend the million. The guy became nervous before answering. Lu said that he still has a lot to improve in the game. Look back, there's the shore. He still hasn't quite figured out where he should spend the money. The guy told his boss to keep the money for himself for now. He would let him know when he needed it. Pei suggested to his interlocutor that he could appoint him to the position of general director. Lu looked at the boss in surprise and asked again. Did he really misunderstand something? He explained to his interlocutor that he could open his own business in any field. The guy Lu smiled with excitement for the boss and said that he agreed. He took the document from his subordinate. He decided it was time to take a look at the future planner. He had already prepared everything. Pei looked at the document. He decided that he would choose for himself anyone for whom at least someone voted. He told the girl named Lieta right there that he was choosing her. The worker was very surprised from her seat. She jumped up over the table in fright. The guy from behind looked at the girl Xiaoli with fear and asked, "Is it really her?" Yada jumped up sharply over the table and told the boss that she still had a lot of work to do. The girl was very scared. She decided that she had angered her boss. Yada remembered with fear that the previous planners had also been promoted, and they had also coped. The girl adjusted her glasses and said that she would try to complete the game called Look Back. The shore is there. Pei looked at the worker and thought that he wouldn't blame her, even if she didn't have the skills. He was sitting at home late in the evening in his apartment in a high-rise building. He bit off the apple in his hands and continued working on his laptop on the sofa. The guy suddenly saw some unpleasant news. He realized that the game had already been published. He couldn't understand why the site had become so popular so quickly. Pei read messages and comments from users. People could not understand exactly what was going on. He couldn't believe that everything was so bad. He decided to read the details. He decided to open the link on the website. He selected the option to read now. Pei thought angrily to himself that someone was helping with the writing for Ma and Kun. After reading, he abruptly slammed the laptop shut. He was delighted. Pei said to himself in a happy voice that the site did not live up to expectations. He thought that this result was due to the fact that a group of students with no experience and a group of Ma and Kun were working. Pei thought to himself that he needed to pin the story to the main page. At least 2,000 people visit the site every day. Everything should go swimmingly. He threw the core into the trash. He remembered that they had recently sent a couple of phones for testing. He wanted to look at them. Pei was holding a box with a device in his hands. He said that he was holding the latest model of the phone. He put on a pair of glasses with a sign that said he was a hardcore gamer. After that, the guy picked up his tools and got ready to begin. Pei began to very quickly and confidently disassemble the phone into parts. He sat on the table and happily said to himself that he was finally finished. Pei said that the shock protection of the new phone is very good, even better than that of the pineapple. He picked up the box with the MSC phone. He still had time. The guy opened the box with the device. He wanted to check the headphones, cameras, and laptops. Late in the evening, a company employee was sitting in his office in a high-rise building.